Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this workshop. It's early in the morning and we all had a very late ending yesterday. So this is Beyond Mining, Protecting Land, Water and Life. And as you can see, we have been for a few days having amazing speakers, providing the insight in what's happening in their own communities and trying to denounce and put out there, what mining and extractivism is doing around the world. But today will be about extractivism in Latin America and how we can look into new alternatives. So we have, before we start, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Wurundjeri land for the Kulin Nations. I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and I would like to leave clear that this land has never been ceded. Mariam.
Thanks, Marisol. I would like to also acknowledge on this call from on the Wurundjeri land, the Kulin Nation, and introduce everyone to this fabulous session. We have extractivism in Latin America, and we are going to be discussing and looking to new alternatives. So deeply understanding what extractivism looks like in Latin America and what the alternatives that people are already building and that we want to create into the future beyond extractivism. So the first part, we'll be looking at the political and historical context of extractivism in Latin America. And we have this wonderful prompt for the part one. So this panel will be organized in part one and part two. And the first will be looking deeply into the history and the structure and the foundations, politically and historically, of extractivism, discussing the consequences of this capitalist framework that allows mining exploitation on our planet, visiting the realities of Latin America and their relationship with the whole world. And we're going to have our guest speaker for 15 to 20 minutes, Danny, and then we'll be going into a Q&A discussion where we invite everyone who's on the call to bring their questions either through Facebook or through the chat. And we have the lovely Absara and Joe helping to moderate those questions and bring them into the discussion. So there'll be space for that after Danny has finished speaking. So to introduce Danny, who's his they, them pronouns, is a member of Izquierda Guerravista de Chile, currently residing in Santiago. Right now they work with the Coordinadora 18th of October, a coordinating body that advocates for the freedom of political prisoners and an independent popular press collective. Over the course of the past year, Danny has taken an active role in the Chilean popular movement. In the past, they have also worked in a student collective in support of the workers' union at the university they attend in Boston, USA. In their spare time, Danny enjoys reading, hiking, and a good coffee. Over to you, Danny.
Thanks for the lovely introduction. And I would also first like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'm currently located in Santiago, which means that I am occupying unceded Mapuche and Inca land, currently located in the section of Wallmapu known as Picunmapu, which describes the northern part of the ancestral Mapuche territory. And through this land acknowledgement, I would like to re-cement my commitment to being in solidarity, active solidarity with Indigenous and specifically Mapuche struggles in this territory. So with that in mind, I would like to begin this conversation by talking about colonialism, which is like the key process that begins bringing capitalism and extractivism to the Latin American continent and to the American continent as a whole, in fact. So when we're talking about extractivism, capitalism, we have to go back not just the past 50 years when we might have seen some of the most wild forms of capitalism, like neoliberalism, and things that might be in more recent memory, but it is necessary to go back hundreds of years to how this system was first established in this territory through the colonial implantation of a racialized capital, like economic, social, and political model. In Chile's history, from first being a territory dominated by the Spanish crown and currently by the Chilean state. That has meant that the land and the people have been exploited by different companies depending on the time period. So for a very long time, Chile was in the north, essentially a saltpeter producing country, which led to a lot of really intense labor struggles in the north of the country, where workers would have uprisings because of the terrible working conditions, and this would lead to massacres, such as a particularly famous massacre in the early 20th century, where almost all striking workers were killed in the school and the place that they were occupying. And incidents like this have been reoccurring throughout the history. Parallel to this, the Mapuche people in the South, and I'm not an expert in this, but I would like to mention it because it's terribly important and relevant, have led their own resistance both to the Spanish crown and to the Chilean state and to the multinational corporations that have come to exploit their lands that they are trying to retake or are in the process of reconquering. And so that's a little bit of the more like long-term history and of how this sort of begins to be implanted as capitalism and as a colonial model that intends to extract resources from the colonized territory while at the same time settling people there to create a workforce and dislocate the indigenous people currently living there. These two processes sort of in parallel create two differently exploitable workforces that are that have a hierarchy between them. You have the racialized people and the people who are racialized as white in the colony, and these two groups can sort of be exploited more easily and in different ways by the ruling state and the colonial powers. In the case of Chile, because it's also in Latin America, that meant that throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, after Chile was independent of the Spanish crown and became its own state, this also led to the territory being a target of imperialism, primarily by the United States, where multinational corporations would come set up extractivist projects in the territory. Even though it was no longer a colony, the relationship of exploiting power and exploited people and land was still very much something that was present. And to bring this to sort of more recent history, this sort of culminated in, or began culminating, as it is currently culminating right now and will continue culminating because that's how these processes work. But it sort of begins bringing itself to a head when neoliberalism becomes implanted in Chile, as sort of it has become known as like the world's laboratory of neoliberalism, which, and by neoliberalism, we understand a set of policies, economic, social, political, that sort of facilitate free market, little government spending, austerity policies in a given state. And these kind of come as a reaction to the Popular Unity government's nationalization of resources like copper. The Popular Unity was a government in Chile that was a broad coalition of different left fronts to bring Salvador Allende, a socialist, into the presidency, and a sort of socialist government that started to take all these different initiatives that took away some power from the main economic players, such as nationalizing resources like copper. And so as a reaction to this, the imperial power of the United States saw its economic interests threatened and exacerbated an economic crisis in the country, which eventually led to a coup d'etat by Pinochet. And in this process, you begin a decades-long process of violent repression that goes hand in hand with the implantation of neoliberalism in the country, where you have multiple kinds of violence at play in order to establish this more sort of like this wilder form of capitalism. That is still the natural development point of capitalism. It would have headed there anyway, but it needed this extra violence in order to become implanted in a society that at this point had built a huge amount of popular power that could potentially resist to this. But it had to go hand in hand with huge amounts of repression, huge amounts of economic, social, and political violence through what has come to be known as like the shock doctrine and plantation model of neoliberalism. And this is a pattern that gets repeated not only in Chile, but in other countries. It gets exported throughout the rest of South America, where similar political moves take place with coups happening in the rest of the continent, all backed and supported by the CIA in the United States in defense of their economic interests in the land, but also eventually gets exported out to the exploiting first world countries. We see it in the United States through Ronald Reagan's government, and in the United Kingdom through Thatcher, and presumably also in so-called Australia, but I don't really know the history there. But it becomes a much more worldwide thing following what happens in Chile in 1973. But even though the dictatorship itself gets ousted in the late 1988 through, well, a decade and a half of like strong resistance and popular movements, but also formally through a vote, the 90s represent a way for the neoliberal models to consolidate themselves under this visage of democracy, of liberal democracy. And you can really see this in the policies that get enacted by the governments elected in the 90s under this new democratic order, that all that they do is really go deeper into the into all the different neoliberal policies that originated under Pinochet. Especially you can see this in the amount of free trade agreements that were signed by Chile in the 90s. In the 70s and 80s, we weren't involved in many free trade agreements because it was simply not very popular to have a free trade agreement with a dictator. But suddenly we were democratic, and so suddenly we could have free trade agreements instead. And through that, we can see the amount of different trading partners that pop up. The United States, different places in Europe, even China become some of the important Chilean trading partners. And throughout the 90s, you also see a lot of the same different companies coming in and setting up extractivist in both in mining, but also extractivism in terms of like forestry and energy generation industries all over the country. Now, the impact of extractivism in Chilean society, we mostly talk about it through talking about what are called sacrifice zones. These are different towns or cities or places where the different types of extractive industries have had really terrible effects on the population, mostly at the level of health, but also on an environmental level. So there are 5 of these. I'll give a few examples. For example, in Petorca, and people who have seen me on a panel have heard me talk about all these examples before because they're the ones I bring up all the time. But for example, Petorca, it is a town where all of the water actually gets diverted into avocado avocado crops. And so the people who actually live in that town and work with those crops don't get any water. You have to haul water in on trucks for those people a couple times a day. This has become particularly relevant now in a pandemic where the most important preventative measure you can take is to wash your hands. You can't really wash your hands if you don't have water. There are also places like Quinteros Puchuncaví, which is a zone where you have right now around 20 different industrial plants, which are mostly carbon-powered thermoelectric plants, where in the 60s you only had one copper smelter. So in the years between the coup and now, you had a true explosion of industrial plants in that area. And this has led to such health effects like in 2018, there was a huge gas leak from one of the plants that led to around 1,400 people being treated or hospitalized for gas poisoning in local hospitals. There in the north, we also have Antofagasta, which is a huge mining town, where it was around January of this year, it was discovered through blood and urine testing that 8% of adults have a higher than is healthy level of arsenic in their body, and 12% of kids have a higher than healthy level of arsenic in their body. Now, if you ask me, the healthy amount of arsenic that you can have in your body is 0 ideally, but apparently there is a level that we're allowing, and this is like even higher than that. And then there are also zones that are often forgotten because they're closer to urban centers like Quilicura, which is a municipality in Santiago, where there was a big local struggle to get the levels of heavy metals allowed in water to be taken down, because it was set up so that in this specific place, because of the amount of industry present, it was legally allowed for there to be a higher level of heavy metals in water than in the entire rest of the city. So there was a huge local struggle to get that evened out with the rest of the city, not even taken to no heavy metals in water. We're just talking less heavy metals in water. This is the level at which we are at. Now, when we consider that a lot of the impact of extractivism ends up being played out in people's health, it also ties in really infuriatingly with the way that neoliberal policy attacks the public health infrastructure through privatization. Um, since the since the implantation of neoliberal policies, one thing that's greatly been weakened is the Chilean public health system, which includes public hospitals and primary care centers and other health establishments. These have been mostly replaced by we have a sort of mixed model where you can have access to a public option or a private option. And what this ends up leading to is the underfunding, chronic and severe underfunding of the public health option. Because it will end up that the wealthier people or people who have access to more resources will end up at the private health institutions, and so they will have more funding than the public ones. Also, the public health institutions in terms of a budget have to contend with the other economic priorities of the government, who you might think would be prioritizing health for people, but no. And this also intersects with neoliberal policy in other ways. For example, it will trap people in unsafe working conditions because a failing public school system and a privatized higher education system make it much more accessible for people to enter careers like mine or other careers where they will be easily exploited by these multinationals. And I mentioned this last time I was on a LastNet panel, but a lot of multinational mining companies especially will use this as an opportunity to get a little bit of a PR makeover in, because they'll give their workers' kids some kind of scholarship so that they can study in a mining related field and then come back and work at the very same mining place that exploited their parents. So you're trapping the population in a sort of dependency loop with the extractivist industry, so that at that point, kicking them out means that you are economically on your own, and many people will lose their livelihoods, which often ends up creating this gender dynamic where the people who are struggling against these multinational corporations tend to be women because they are not employed at them, whereas the men who inhabit these places do tend to be employed at them, and you can try to organize to get your employer kicked out of the place you live, but most people wouldn't. And so that's how different neoliberal policies especially will interact with extractivism to make the entire situation worse. There's also a heavy intersection at this point, even now, with colonialism. I know I started with this, but I want to bring it back because a lot of hydroelectric projects, especially, that also will claim to create green energy and have little impact on the environment, but that will still end up polluting, contaminating, or diverting rivers. Will do that on unceded indigenous land that includes rivers. And so often the struggle against hydroelectric plants specifically and forestry industry is like led by indigenous movements, especially the Mapuche people. This also leads to unfortunately, it leads to activists against extractivist projects to get murdered. There was a particularly publicized case of Macarena Valdez, who was working. She was a Mapuche woman living in a Mapuche community, and she was working against an extractivist project that was going to install itself in the land that she was living on, in a river. It was a hydroelectric project as well. And she mysteriously ended up committing suicide, in quotes. It was a really, really difficult situation because she was found by her child too. And this is like something that is a real risk if you are going to take a stand against different types of extractivism. I know this is coming up like later talking about popular resistance, but I think it is worth mentioning that people currently are and do fight back against the way that extractivism has implanted itself here and the negative effects that it brings to the population. One big example, of course, are the Mapuche people who lead an active resistance by reclaiming the land that was stolen from them through acts of sabotage and reclaiming land and that kind of thing. And that is a huge advancement in terms of resisting extractivism in this territory. But another huge amount of organizing happened, I would say, before October last year, which is when we had like a huge explosion of local level organizing. The most amount of local level organizing was happening in sacrifice zones and in other territories where extractivism was highly present. And especially organizing around getting these projects taken out of the land, or at the very least mitigating their effects, such as the local group in Quilicura that I mentioned that was advocating to get the amount of heavy metal in the water taken down, or evening out with the rest of the city. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about. I hope that it got a good amount of context in. I am trying not to run on for too long, but I wanted to talk to you about the larger context, sort of the more recent historical context, some of the immediate effects of negative effects of extractivism, and a little bit of popular resistance. So thank you so much for the space to talk about these things, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this panel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Danny. We really appreciate your presentation and the education that you're offering for people who may not be familiar with these topics. Cool. Maybe we will, how are we going for time? All right, we've got good for time. And maybe we'll open up the question and answer discussion part of this part one now. If we have some questions, do we have any questions, Joe Abzar, from the Facebook or from the chat yet?
I don't have any questions, but maybe Joe does.
No questions yet. Hopefully some will come in very soon.
Maybe I have a question I could ask. Danny, if you'd like to speak to, how do you think, in terms of throughout history, for example, in the example of Chile, the organization of the left and the social movements, how do you think that that's shifted over time in terms of thinking about the intersection of colonialism? Like, from example, from the Allende period to now, or how do you think that the consciousness in the social movements, anti-capitalist movements, do you think that there has been an evolution in understanding how capitalism and colonialism are connected and how the resistance has to be intersectional? What's your thoughts on that over time and presently, and areas to improve?
That's a really great question. I mean, I think we could always use more of that consciousness, but an interesting thing that I was able to observe over the last year, especially since October, was that at protests, you would see a huge amount of Hueñufolle, which is one of several like Mapuche symbology. It's like a flag. As far as I understand it, it's not like the flag, but it is a very common flag used to represent Mapuche people. And so you would see that everywhere. You would also see things like I saw this actually quite a bit and it stayed with me. On walls, like one of the things that people would spray paint would be, we all have indigenous blood. Rich people have it on their hands and poor people have it in their veins. I'm doing a rough translation there, but sort of that gives you an idea of how there begins to be, or I don't know if it begins, but there's certainly a consciousness of the way that the two struggles are interlinked and how both people have been exploited in a way that's like very interrelated with each other. I think that you could probably argue that there's like, it hasn't been quite enough. Well, actually, I read this really wonderful essay by a Mapuche historian who was basically asking the question of, is this consciousness going to remain and become deepened, or is it going to, or is it sort of like an aesthetic thing? And we don't really have a clear answer. As far as I can tell, those symbols are still very present and that sentiment is still running, but I don't think it's clear as of now whether like the level of consciousness is going to be something that's going to be deepened into a critique of colonialism, including a critique of the way that the Chilean state is in itself a colonial project. I think there was a lot of discourse happening around those topics, especially because we recently had a referendum on whether we would write a new constitution. And so one of the things coming into play there was whether there would be an amount of, well, basically how like indigenous representation would play out in the process of writing the new constitution. So there's an organism that's in charge of writing it, right? It's called a constitutional convention. And so the question was whether within that constitutional convention there would be a certain amount of seats that would go exclusively to indigenous people, and through what mechanism that would take place and that kind of thing. And so that opens up a big discussion about like whether and I saw both. It was like a big tension between sort of like, well, yes, we desperately need indigenous representation in the creation of this, if there's going to be a creation of this. And then there was another sort of, I don't know about opposite, but a tension between people who would say like the indigenous movement, specifically the Mapuche indigenous movement, is more autonomous than anything. So why would you want to, or why would speaking, I don't want to speak for anyone, but like the coming from them, it would have been, why would we want to include ourselves in the process of the colonial state that is imposing itself on our territory? And so you started to see that. I don't know at what level that you could call that a mainstream discourse, but it started to become a question, right? Even putting the idea out there that like there can or cannot be these reserved seats for indigenous people admits that there has been a historical exclusion with those groups. And so you start to, at the very least, it puts it on the list of topics that people are thinking about and talking about. Even though there's certainly a lot of tension there, I think probably more so in indigenous spaces that are grappling with the question of, do we want to participate in this, or should we push for an entirely autonomous project? Which is not my place to speak of, but that is kind of like the dialogue I saw.
Mm. Thank you.
I have a question. Thank you, Dani. So would be good, if you can stand and comment on the links on extractivism and capitalism. So because some people think that there are different models of development, or that's the question. That some people believe that these are different models of development.
Like, I'm not sure I understand the question. Like that extractivism and capitalism are different modes of development, or that there are modes of development that are separate from those things together?
So some people think that there are different models of development.
Oh, right. That there could be alternative models of development that are not linked to capitalism and extractivism. Is that
That's
what you're
correct.
saying?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think at that point we can start to question what we mean by development. Like, are we talking about technological development, economic development? And at that point, depending on whether we decide that's even a notion we would want necessarily, that's kind of where I would start the discussion, actually, is by like defining what we mean by development when we talk about it. And is that something that's intrinsically linked to extractivism or not? Like just questioning at the very base of that. Personally, and at this point, I'm not speaking for my organization because I don't recall having this discussion. It's also possible I'm forgetting it, but I don't recall. I really would question whether like development needs to happen on economic terms and what that means, like, because that implies a notion of progress that is inherently colonial. So maybe we shouldn't be focusing necessarily on development, but just on having a society that is able to meet the needs of the people that inhabit it at the very, very local level, like at the level of the base. And in terms of like alternative models of development, that opens up an entire world, because then you're not constrained by like things like economic development or even technological development necessarily, even though I would assume that some degree of it is necessary in things like health or etc. But it even opens up to saying like maybe there are things that we're doing right now that we don't need, such as, for example, carbon extraction, or similar things. And I think that's like maybe a broader question. I don't know if I really got to the spirit of your question. I maybe just rambled for a bit.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you, Danny.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Oh, great. Maybe we have a couple of people who have been waiting in the chat, Joe, but hold on to
Yeah,
that thought.
it is from chat.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, so one from Tessa. Is there tension between the centrality of miners and other working class occupations to the popular unity / socialist movement and Indigenous struggles against extractivism? There's actually two questions here. That's the first one. The second one is, what percentage of people, that's known, on a national level have livelihoods tied to these industries?
Well, for the second question, I'm going to say it already. I don't know. I don't know what the percentage is. It probably at a national level, I think even giving a number on a national level might be a little bit misleading because it varies so much depending on locality. Like it's a higher percentage the more north you go, for example, if you're talking about mining. But I also don't know these numbers. As for the first question, there is a little bit of a tension, yeah, especially you could see it in last year around October, November, December. The miners' unions just refused to go on strike despite everything that was happening in the country. So there was this sort of perception that they really were more interested in just like their labor struggles in terms of pay, vacation, benefits, and that kind of thing, things that they do go more regularly on strike for than the rest of the popular movement. It's also, I think it also plays out because a lot of workers in the country, I did have the numbers on this. If I remember correctly, it's something like 20 or 30% are not formally under contract. Miners tend to be formally under contract, but other people are independent workers, which means much more precarity in terms of labor. The way that this plays out is you have one of two ways to sort of be an independent worker. One is like you are still formally linked to a company that's employing you. It's just instead of having a contract, you get paid on you give them a receipt every month for the services that you gave them, which like still implies a sort of link between the employer and the worker, but it's not very strong and there's very few legal protections in the way of it. They can basically just stop paying you whenever. And then there's the like even more informal, which is like you are selling things on the street or reselling stuff, or you have like a very, very like small business, but not really legalized on Instagram or something. And so there's definitely a tension between like the level of precarity that workers are experiencing. So like, for example, like if you are in either category of independent worker that I mentioned, you are probably not in a union. Not that unions are particularly strong here. They are not, because there were a bunch of anti-labor laws passed during Pinochet's rule, but you don't even have that level of protection. There is no level of protection at all. And lately, especially in the public sector, there's been like some development in terms of labor organizing around independent workers. But in the private sector, like not very much at all. And so there is tension between like workers that are organized in unions and still have a strong focus on their own particular labor struggles and like other workers, which represent a really large percentage of the workers in the country, that sort of have to fend for themselves and operate on a level of like informality and precarity that that workers in like traditional industries or extractivist industries just don't have to face.
I've got one more question from Andy, if there's time for that. And has religion played, and does it play a role in the colonial project?
Yes. I mean, like unequivocally, yes. I don't know that I'm the best person to talk about this, but certainly it has a huge role. Like, for example, there's like a lot of evangelist projects, especially in the south of Chile. There have been historically, but they currently are still there. And so that's where you see a lot of like the more, I mean, Christianity is an evangelical religion. What it wants to do is expand and preach and expand and preach. It was one of the like basic activities that occurred during the beginning of colonization. It hasn't stopped since. And so it is certainly a part of it. Yeah. I don't know what else to say. We could talk about gender if you want, but I don't know if you want to.
Feel free to. We have just another question in the chat, which is amazing talk, Danny. Thank you. I'd like to hear more about the concept of sacrifice zones and maybe hear further examples of this playing out in Chile and other places in Latin America or around the world. I feel this is the term, first time I've heard the term, but it makes a lot of sense in the politics of colonialism, capitalism, extractivism. Would love to learn more. That's from Josh.
Yeah. Sacrifice zones, I am not clear on precisely who coined the term, but it is very much in use here, and it refers especially to like it'll refer especially to like a place where an industry has come in and made the place very difficult to inhabit for the people there, has serious effects on health and also on ecology. So when I'm talking about, for example, Petorca being a sacrifice zone, what that means is that the avocado industry has come in and diverted the flow of water so that the natural ecosystem there cannot flourish, and the people there do not have access to a basic need, which is water. It means that in Quinteros and Puchuncaví, you have really high levels of, or really a huge amount of people that are affected by these chemical gas leaks. And in Quinteros and Puchuncaví, it's actually not uncommon for people to be on the beach and like just stumble upon a dead bird because the air is unbreathable and the soil is it is also like untenable. People there will tend to develop higher rates of cancer and other diseases because of the impact of the chemicals on the environment, the toxins generally. And this is something that's like very widely discussed in Chile. I talked about it to an Argentinian friend a few months ago, and they didn't seem to have the concept, or at least not that she knew about it, but it's something that's still present in the territory. For example, I know that I think it's Colombia, a lot of people who work in coffee plantations will have a lot of health problems because of the pesticides that are used on the coffee plants that will end up with people like being more likely to develop like cancer or other diseases like that. So that's what a sacrifice zone refers to. And I'm sure that if we think about it, we could probably think about many, many examples where you're not necessarily using the term, but it would probably be appropriate. Like actually, for example, Flint in the United States could be called a sacrifice zone. I don't know if you guys have heard about Flint, but Flint, Michigan is a place where the water is incredibly poisoned because the water, I think, is privatized by Nestle, I think, and just not cleaned at all. There's huge amounts of lead in the water. It kind of got really big maybe some 8 years ago. People sort of stopped talking about it, but as far as I know, the people of Flint still don't have clean water. And I don't think they use the terminology of it being a sacrifice zone, but that would still apply because the people are actively being harmed by an industry that has taken root there and has extracted value from the land and from the people.
Thank you. Thanks so much. There was another question from Marie Delora who said, yes, please discuss gender, as you reported before.
Okay, I mean, yeah. Gender, the way that we have like gender as a system is like inextricably tied to a colonial project, which is not to say that there weren't maybe like similar even gender structures present in indigenous cultures across the world, but like there were definitely some that didn't have the same gender system that we have now. And so when we talk about, like, for example, I brought this up when we were talking about religion, like religion, Catholicism and Christianity especially have extremely rigid gender roles that are both linked to like a sort of like canon of like a biblical canon of like, this is what women do. Women are supposed to emulate Mary. This is what men do. Like they can do everything else. Whereas like those stories and constructs are not present in indigenous societies. So when we talk about colonialism, it's sort of like our understanding of gender has to fall apart along with it because it's something that's been implanted with the colonial project as well. And so religion plays a huge part of that too. For example, I forget which region of Mexico this is in, but like, for example, the Muxes are like a sort of separate gender category in a certain part of Mexico that I am blanking on, that is like through the indigenous culture there, like that has been sort of kept alive, and people today still identify as Mushe, which is sort of like somebody who was, if I remember correctly, it will be somebody who was like sort of we could talk about them as like assigned male at birth, but like takes on more like feminine social roles. And religion has had a big part in like implanting like patriarchal Western gender roles and destroying what was previously there. And this is, again, not to like idealize any indigenous culture as being something it wasn't, but simply saying that the systems either way were different because there was a different social categorization. There were even places that didn't apply an understanding of gender, where like whether you had like whether your body was capable of gestating or not was like not relevant beyond the fact that it allowed you to gestate or not. And so when we talk about like colonialism, religion, and gender, those three things are sort of very interlinked.
Great, thanks heaps, Danny. So we have another question, some comments. Yeah, people talking about other examples of non-Western gender systems. We have one question on decolonization. So yeah, how the politics of decolonization in the context of Chile or more broadly in Latin America is understood within the different social movements, and is there a tension between the, for example, Mapuche struggle and decolonization and the project of the left, and is there ways that this project is working together in solidarity, or is there tensions? Maybe to have discussion on this, and then we might be heading towards part 2 soon.
Okay. So the first thing I'm going to say to that is I don't think that we're at a point where we can say there is a cohesive left project. Like, I think it really depends on who you talk to, what their experience is, and that sort of thing, that you'll end up sort of hearing like maybe a different project and a different perspective on whether it should be decolonial and like what that would mean. I do think from what I know about like a lot of local groups, like there does always or very recently over the past year, the demands of the especially of Mapuche political prisoners have been vocally represented within like local organizing groups, like local assemblies and that kind of thing. So for example, in like a list of demands that that might be put out for an action or something, I have seen a lot of them demanding like the liberation of Mapuche political prisoners. The organization that I'm a part of, the Coordinadora 18 de Octubre for the freedom of political prisoners, it primarily has links with like Chilean political prisoners, but anytime we do an action or release any kind of communication, we also include Mapuche political prisoners in what we are saying. The difference is, of course, that they have their own support structures. You can't just come in and try to white savior them, but you simply have to keep present that those two those are two struggles that are sort of interlinked. Like, I think that there is that perspective that like the Chilean people and the Mapuche people have to act in solidarity with one another. Specifically what that means, I think, is still a subject of debate, and a point of contention, certainly between different left projects. As for my organization, like we believe that like we believe that we and the Mapuche people are allies against the Chilean state, as it is a state that is oppressing both peoples. And in that sense, you have to sort of turn to this very local understanding of who the land actually belongs to. And it belongs to the people that are, well, both primarily to the people occupying it and using it and working it, not purchasing it, not exploiting it, just the people who are living on it. And so in a lot of the country, that does mean the indigenous people that are present. And that is sort of how we understand how decolonization has to take place. I don't think I said that correctly. I'm sorry. But where was I? Oh, yeah. So sort of by turning things to a local level and essentially getting like the enemy here is the Chilean state, and it is the multinationals, and it is those things. And so for now, what that means is that the the main actions we can take have to be in solidarity with the Mapuche people. I think this got away from me a little bit towards the end, but I hope it was understandable.
No, great. Yeah, great to hear. Yeah, reflections on that topic. Have we got any more questions from the Facebook? Joe Absara? Or any other questions from anyone here that would like to unmute and ask a question? As we're getting towards time for part 2. Lucho.
Yeah, I don't know, you can help me, Danny, because I think people is, much of us be confused because they're talking about socialism and related the socialism to what the experience has been already happening. And I think this is important. People, or we need to understand that the socialism or the alternative to capitalism is in development. So people need to, we need to build that kind of system or alternative to extractivism or capitalism. What do you think about that?
I agree completely. I think there's like also a confusion when we talk about socialism, specifically when we talk about socialism, because we have seen different models of socialism. And so I think sometimes when people talk about it, they might be thinking about one thing and then somebody else is talking about a different example. So for example, like somebody could be talking about the USSR and somebody could be talking about Cuba and somebody might even be talking about Kurdistan. So you're talking about like 3 models of things that are calling themselves socialism, but are all very different from each other. And so, yeah, I agree completely with what you said. Like these have to be alternatives that are in construction right now through organizing at the local level. We can see, for example, like local assemblies happening that are organizing to solve like local problems are a very primitive stage of this. And if you wanted to see a much more advanced sort of project that has been constructing an alternative to capitalism is, for example, like the Zapatistas in Chiapas, where you have that sort of like from below organization of the territory in a way that's like obviously very particular and rooted in the indigenous tradition there, but also is something that like is constructed in like in a constantly changing and evolving way. And so it's up to us to construct an alternative to capitalism, whatever we may decide to call it. But I do agree with you that that when we talk about socialism, we have to be specific about what we're talking about and keep in mind that the alternatives to capitalism are the things that we are constructing right now, are the things that we are tasked with constructing right now.
Thank you. Maybe we might have a short break soon, but maybe is there anyone else who would like to ask another question before we have a 5-minute break?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll ask a question. It's related to the last one, I suppose. One of the issues here, and I'm asking how much is the same in Chile, is that I suppose what in loose terms called the traditional left, to what extent has it been left behind by the quicker flow of events these days?
I guess by traditional left, do you mean like political parties that are called that? Like, for example, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, that kind of thing?
I think in part, but I don't know whether there's, from my experience, where there is a clear-cut borderline either.
Yeah. I think, well, when we're talking about like political parties like the ones that I just named, they're very disconnected from the popular movement. And a lot of it has to do with how they were involved in the governments of the 90s and the 2000s that deepened the neoliberal project, particularly like the Socialist Party had a president, Michelle Bachelet, whose approach was to continue along that same line. I mean, the Communist Party, though it is marked a little bit of a difference, has certainly not been exempt from those same tendencies. And in fact, they have they have somebody who's probably going to run for president. He has not formally announced it, but it looks like it. And whenever he gives an interview on TV, what he basically sells as his program is like the continuation of Bachelet's program, which was a deepening of neoliberal policy. So I'm not even sure that we can really call them left at this point, considering what they've done in terms of like the actual policies that they have enacted. And then as for the left that is outside of that institutionality, well, and then there's like other parties that are sort of pandering to certain things that people on the left like to hear, but also are like, we're not the left and we're not the right, we're just us, which is kind of like this wishy-washy sort of hippy dippy thing. That also leaves people feeling deeply unsatisfied because they end up voting with the right anyway, on things that end up having devastating implications for people regardless. So useless. And then if you like sort of leave that institutional framework, I would say that what calls itself the left is still pretty splintered. I mean, we're talking about different like organizations or parties that are not particularly cohesive. Like there's no broad front of leftist organizations. There have been some attempts, especially like for resisting particular things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There was an attempt to create like an anti-capitalist sort of front to resist against specifically the TPP and other FTAs. But all those attempts have sort of like fizzled out eventually. What I would say is like possibly more cohesive is to look at the popular movement itself, the way that it has organized into assemblies, which don't usually like turn themselves left or right, but when you look at the demands, like they do sit in this understanding of the way that like capitalism is untenable in this territory or in any territory. And so you can probably feasibly call them left, even if they don't necessarily like organize as parties or call themselves political organizations necessarily, but they do stand for those demands. And so when you look at that, there do tend to be like a lot of demands and things that will pop up. It's still at the point where you're talking about demands, like demanding things of the state, while still constructing like their own organization. So it's still like at a point where it's really greatly evolving, but I would say that is perhaps more worthwhile to talk about like the popular movement itself than actual parties or organizations that have either called themselves the left or that maybe actually are more so on the left, just because there is no real broad front, no coalition. Some of them have better insertion into popular movements, have presence in assemblies, have different projects and stuff. I would say that the organization that I'm in has done a fairly good job. But there's like no broad coalition to speak of, and the popular movement doesn't really consider any, certainly not any institutional left parties, but also has its general distrust for political organizations that has sort of been like sowed by the way that the institutional left parties have acted. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Jenny. So everyone, we're going to go to a short 5-minute break, and then we're going to be coming back. Please come back for part 2. We have the incredible Hugo Tucuri from Canaib, from Peru, and another speaker from the Wayu Indigenous Communities in Colombia, who will be speaking in the part 2. And Marisol Salinas from LessNet will be hosting. So please stay. It's only going to be a 5-minute break just to stretch your legs. And we'll also have some more information. If people also would like to add their emails and into the chat to be added to the Facebook, to add it to the LessNet email address, please feel free to add your email into the chat if you're not already added into the Facebook, into the LessNet email list, to receive more information and learn more about these topics and how you can get involved in the Latin American Solidarity Network. And we'll also have some more information about how you can get involved and ongoing campaigns towards the end. But for now, we're going to leave you with a song from Anita Tijoux, a Chilean revolutionary hip hop artist. Her song called Somos Sur. So we're going to play this song and then we'll come back, everyone, for part 2. Thank you so much for being present with us, and we'll see you in a moment. Let's see if I can share my screen. And yes, we've got it, and we're shared, and we're playing.
Tú nos dices que debemos sentarnos, pero las ideas solo pueden levantarnos, caminar, recorrer, no rendirse ni retroceder, ver. Aprender como esponja absorbe, nadie sobre levantarnos, caminar. Tú nos dices que debemos sentarnos, pero las ideas solo pueden levantarnos, caminar, retroceder, ver, aprender como esponja absorbe. Nadie sobre todos, faltan todos, suman todos para todos, todo para nosotros. Soñamos en grande que se caiga el imperio, lo gritamos algo, no queda más remedio. Esto no es utopía, es alegre rebeldía del baile de los que sobran de la danza tuya y mía. Levantarnos para llevar, ni África ni América Latina se suba. Con barro, con casco, con lápiz a patear el fiasco, provocar un social terremoto en este charco. Mil veces venceremos, del cielo al suelo y del suelo al cielo vamos. Caballito blanco, vuelve pa' tu pueblo, no te tenemos miedo, tenemos vida y fuego. Fuego en nuestras manos, fuego en nuestros ojos, tenemos tanta vida y esta fuerza color rojo. La niña María no quiere tu castigo, se va a liberar con el suelo palestino. Somos africanos, latinoamericanos, somos este sur y juntamos nuestras manos. Todos los callados, todos los omitidos, todos los invisibles, todos
That was good. Good music, good songs. Oh, Diego, how you said in English will be the voiceless, yes? All the voiceless?
Yeah.
Invisible?
All of the voiceless, all of the
Invisible?
invisible people, all of the fallen, callados.
Yeah.
All of us, all of us. Actually, very in theme because Lucho has made everyone todos somos todos.
Yeah, exactly. That's how it is. Mary, so we have 3 speakers, and so we are going to need your skills to translate.
You're great at this too, you know.
No.
Oh, yes, you are.
Believe me, especially under pressure, oops, no good at all.
It's awful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Pressure.
So I start, instead of going forward, I start going backwards, you know, so.
It's so
I'm
hard.
sure you don't. I've heard you do it and you're very good.
Oh, that person loved me so much. Don't forget that we are recording. This is all going live. We haven't stopped the recording.
All right. All the better. And who's going to speak first?
So that's why we have Hugo connected. I can see Hugo, and I can see also Sebastian and no, I cannot see Severino. So we are still, so he's gonna connect because we have 3 speakers.
Mm-hmm.
So I was hoping that we can have probably Sebastian as the first one. Sebastian, can you please put your camera on? The same Hugo?
Marisol, would you like me to share the part 2 slide?
Yeah, I would love to. And I wanted to ask Aspara if she will continue looking into questions through the Facebook, and Joy through the chat. Thank you, Joy. So Aspara hasn't responded, so. Yep, let me know. We're ready?
Yeah, I'm just telling you.
Let me know when you're ready.
Yeah.
Sebastian, can you hear me? Sebastian? I can see Sebastian, but looks like he cannot hear us. Hugo, can you hear us? Hugo.
Hola, buen día.
Hola, Hugo. O Sebastián.
Buenos días, hermano.
Aló.
Hola.
Hola, ¿cómo estás?
Bien, gracias, hermana.
Qué bien. ¿Tú puedes conectar tu cámara, Hugo? Ahí está, ahí sí te podemos ver. Sí, ya estamos vamos a comenzar muy pronto. Lo que yo te quería decir es que Mary Delora, ella te va a ayudar con la traducción. Y como tú sabes, siempre es bueno
Bien.
que sea corto, cosa de que ella tenga la oportunidad de traducir.
Sí, claro, por supuesto.
Sí, ¿no? Así que ahí tienes como entre 10 y 15 minutos para que tú hables y después, bueno, al final vamos a abrir para preguntas. Son 3 los oradores que tenemos hoy. Eres tú, tenemos otro compañero de Colombia y tenemos otro compañero hermano desde el Ecuador.
Bien, hermano,
¿Parece?
no hay problema. Cuando digan ustedes. Gracias.
Sí, sí, vamos a empezar contigo. Tú ya conoces a Mary. All right, so I was just explaining to Hugo, who is one of our speakers, the process, and that Mary Delora is going to help with translation. And I think we are ready. Just for Marian.
Yeah, can you see the slide okay?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
And then, and then when you're ready, I'll just go to part 2. And
Yeah,
then
we are ready.
To the last one, which is, like the donations for the YU campaign.
Yep.
So I'll just go back. So just let me know when you're ready and I'll click the button.
Yeah, I'm ready now.
Okay. Part 2.
There we are. All right. So just to welcome everyone, for those who just joined this discussion, just to mention that in this second part, we are going to look into different campaigns, for Latin America. These are from indigenous peoples' struggles and also grassroots movements. We're talking about these indigenous communities and grassroots movement who are at the moment resisting. They are fighting to continue living in their land, or some of them moving back into their land. So these are communities and also grassroots movements who are denouncing extractivism and facing the neoliberal policies, for example, jail, abusive behavior. Some of them get killed during this process in fighting and denouncing extractivist neoliberal policies. So we are going to start with our first speaker, but first, again, I would like if we could acknowledge for those the land where we are today. I'm in Melbourne, that's NAM, so-called Australia. And I would like to pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. So we're in Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nations. And also I would like to leave clear that this land has never been ceded. And we will start with our first speaker. We have at the moment with us Hugo Takuri. So Hugo Takuri is from Peru. He's an indigenous leader from Peru, part of the Indigenous People Confederation in Peru. And Mary Dolora is going to help us with the translation. Welcome, Hugo.
Estimados hermanas y hermanas, buen día. Reciban nuestro saludo de parte de la Confederación de Nacionalidades Indígenas del Perú.
Hugo, no te escuchamos bien, el volumen. Se te escucha como bajito y como que se desaparece tu voz.
Bueno, ahí voy, nuevamente.
Ahí sí estamos, hermano.
Estimados hermanas y hermanos, buen día. Reciban nuestro saludo de parte de la Confederación de Nacionalidades Indígenas del Perú, con ahí al que representa.
He greeted us in his own language, Quechua, and he said that, dear brothers and sisters, I am really happy to be here today.
Gracias, hermano Lucho, por la invitación y a los organizadores de este encuentro de nuestros pueblos originarios para tratar sobre el extractivismo en nuestro territorio.
No se oye muy bien, perdona, no oigo muy bien lo que estás diciendo.
Gracias, hermano Lucho, por la invitación y a los organizadores a este encuentro de nuestros pueblos originarios, donde vamos a tratar el tema del extractivismo.
I want to thank the organizers of this activity. I also want to thank our brother Lucho for setting the whole thing up for us. I was just saying, sorry to interrupt, that I couldn't hear very well. I don't know if other people can hear properly or if it's just me.
Oh, you need to
Nuestra,
be more close to the microphone. Tienes que acercarte un poco más al micrófono, Hugo,
hay interferencia. Bien.
porque hay como una
Sí.
interferencia.
Bueno, nuestra solidaridad con la y el pueblo originario de Australia, el gobierno de Australia con su área estada, y haya sido maltratado, llamado quitar camino.
Hugo no se escucha bien.
Lo siento mucho, no oigo.
No se puede oír.
Nuestra solidaridad en base y originario de Japón en Australia, donde el 6 de octubre el gobierno de Victoria, estado del sur de Australia, profanaron su área sagrada donde se ubican los árboles sagrados de su cultura ancestral.
Hugo no se entiende. ¿Puede decirlo de nuevo o acérquese al micrófono?
Sí, lo tengo cerca, hermano.
Ahí sí, ahí sí.
Bueno, nuevamente quizás decir, nuestra solidaridad con la embajada y el pueblo originario de Ajapurrum en Australia, donde el 26 de octubre del presente año el gobierno de Victoria, estado del sur de Australia, profanaron su área sagrada, donde se ubican los árboles sagrados de su cultura milenaria ancestral, y haya sido trastocado.
I wanted to express my deep solidarity with the Jabwurrung people. Yes, with the Jabwurrung people in the state of Victoria in Australia, because in October this year, the state of Victoria chopped down their sacred trees, and I'm wanting to express solidarity with those people.
Bueno, el Perú ha sido bendecido por los recursos, quizás más que cualquier otro. Tenemos mucha extractivismo aquí en el país.
No creo que es porque no estés cerca al micrófono, sino que entra un ruido cada vez que hables. Es extraño.
Claro. ¿Sabes qué? Si quieres, Hugo, podemos empezar por el otro orador mientras vemos cómo podemos arreglar tu sonido, porque cada vez que tú hablas aparece un ruido que no deja que nosotros te escuchemos.
Bien, hermano, no hay problema, espero.
Sí, ok, hermano, muchas gracias.
Hermano, revise el sistema, pasa que algo no está conectado bien.
Sí, ok.
Bien, hermano, ok.
And what I was saying is that I was apologizing with Hugo, because unfortunately we cannot hear properly what he's saying. There is a interference there, that every time he speaks, there is a strange sound. So for Mary Delora, it's very difficult to translate. So he's gonna check his equipment, and he's gonna be our second speaker. So we have Sebastián. I can see Sebastián, and I would like to introduce him. Sebastián, Mary Delora te va a hacer la traducción, y si tú por favor cuando hables, si puedes hablar cortito y dejar tiempo para que ella traduzca. So I'm introducing Sebastián. He's Sebastián Aran Epieu from the Wayuu Nation, and they are in one part in Colombia. So Sebastián is an indigenous leader fighting against extractivism. Mary Delora.
Sí.
Buenas noches.
Good evening.
Buenas noches. ¿Me escuchan?
Sí, te oímos bien.
Bien. Buenas noches a todos. Un saludo fraternal desde la nación Wayuu. Y saludos al pueblo originario de Australia, de Chile, Ecuador, Perú, toda Latinoamérica y del mundo. Desde acá, desde la nación Wayuu, su lucha también son nuestras luchas, porque los pueblos indígenas del mundo tenemos un solo principio que es la salvaguardar la tierra.
I want to give you a greeting, a warm greeting to everybody from the Wayu people here in Colombia and to all the First Nations people in Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and all over the world. From we, the Wayu people, and we want to tell you that our main issue is the struggle for the sacred land. Yeah.
Ok.
Sí,
Bueno,
gracias.
empecemos por hablar de extractivismo en Latinoamérica y voy a tocar el tema particular de la nación Wayuu. Hace aproximadamente 44 años la empresa Cerrejón llegó a nuestro territorio con un sinfín de cartas, de promesas, de una mejor calidad de vida a través de salud, microacueductos, educación para los niños indígenas, cosa que no ha pasado durante estas 4 décadas que ha estado en nuestro territorio.
Mary Delora, your microphone is off. Ahora sí.
Sorry, I didn't do anything. So, perdón, Sebastián. 44 years ago, the Cerrejón company arrived here where we are living, and they promised us a better life. They promised us health care. They promised us education. They promised us a range of improvements to our lives. But 4 decades later, none of that has happened whatsoever. Gracias.
Bueno, en aquella época nuestros padres o abuelos desconocían mucho del contexto internacional de lo que es el tema de extractivismo y la contaminación global, por lo que muchos líderes de territorios que ellos tocaron las puertas cayeron en esas tentaciones y otros que fueron desplazados en contra de su voluntad.
Way back then, 40 years ago, our elder and our grandparents and the older people of our community and our parents, they didn't understand the world context. They didn't understand extractivism or mining, and they didn't manage to operate in that area. So they didn't know how to face up to what was coming. Ya puedes seguir.
Okay. Hoy en día nuestra realidad es una crisis ambiental fuerte. El polvo que respira la mayoría de las comunidades que habitan alrededor de la mina y de la vía férrea es un polvo que está lleno de carbón contaminante que afecta a los pulmones de los abuelos, de los niños. La mayoría de las personas que viven ahí padecen de tuberculosis, enfermedades que tengan que ver con el pulmón. Y más allá de eso, los pequeños ríos que están en el sur de La Guajira han sido contaminados o otros han sido desviados de sus cauces naturales, llevando más a la sequía en épocas de verano en el territorio.
It's a serious environmental crisis for us. All the areas around the mine, you can't breathe properly. The air is full of carbon and the other horrible chemicals that affect the lungs of our people. Our children, our elderly people get very sick. A huge number of people have TB and other lung diseases are really common. And to add to that, all the little tributaries and rivers around where we live are polluted. And some of them have even gone off course. And there's also a severe drought in the area caused by the use of water. Sí, ya pueden seguir.
El gobierno nacional de Colombia tiene el territorio de la nación Wayuu como, digamos, el arca de ellos, porque el territorio Wayuu es rico en gas, carbón, y hoy en día también se proyecta las energías eólicas. Una invasión territorial avasallante en los últimos años aquí en La Guajira. Pero esto también viene acompañado con una extrema pobreza que ha traído en la región. El gobierno nacional dice que es causa de la corrupción y desde nuestra visión eso es causa de la falta de oportunidades y también nos vienen esos megaproyectos que invaden nuestros territorios que antes eran cultivables, donde cultivamos nuestras plantas, comida, y hoy en día la mayoría de nosotros estamos, digamos, cada día siendo más desplazados, arrinconados en nuestro propio territorio.
The Colombian government really values our land. It's rich in gas, it's rich in carbon, and more recently, wind energy is a project they're looking at. But this has been massively damaging. What they are doing has been massively damaging to we Indigenous people, First Nations people. We live in extreme poverty, and the government says, oh, that's because you're corrupt. But of course, it's not there. It's not that. We don't have opportunities, and we need projects. We want to be able, we used to be able to cultivate the land and eat what we grew, but we are being displaced, stopped from growing things and pushed off our own lands. Ya puedes seguir.
Esta nueva generación de indígenas guayú, como en mi caso y otros compañeros, hemos levantado la voz a nivel nacional y a nivel internacional para que se nos escuche, para que se nos respete los derechos constitucionales del año 91, que dice que los territorios indígenas son inalienables, que no pueden ser adquiridos, despojados o alquilados por externos. Son un territorio colectivo, propiedad colectiva, dice la Constitución de Colombia. Pero eso queda en leyes. Realmente en la práctica el gobierno nacional le ha dado herramientas suficientes para que las multinacionales puedan ejecutar sus proyectos en estos territorios que supuestamente deberían ser intocables, sino una propiedad colectiva de las naciones originarias.
The First Nations people, the new generations of Wayuu people have raised their voices. We've raised our voices on the national arena and also internationally, and our rights are clear in the Colombian Constitution, and this is our collective land. It's land that belongs to our people, and it can't be leased and it can't be sold off. But the Colombian government, they've got a nice constitution that says that it's our land, but in the practice, they do not respect the constitution or the laws. And multinational companies are permitted to do whatever they like in our land. Ya, no puede seguir.
Y cuando esto sucede, cuando las voces del pueblo o las voces de nosotros que somos de abajo del territorio empiezan a resurgir, entonces vienen las amenazas contra los líderes sociales. Hace poco el líder social de una organización que se llama Nación Wayuu ha sido víctima de amenazas de muerte, y uno de sus guardias de seguridad el día de ayer fue herido de bala en estas propias circunstancias. Entonces, más allá de que nosotros nos están arrinconando en el territorio, también somos amenazados. Nuestra seguridad está en peligro.
When we do raise our voices and demand our rights, there is violence and there are attacks and there is killings of social leaders and attacks on them. And one of the leaders of the Wayuu Nation has been receiving death threats. And only just recently, a few days ago, one of his bodyguards was shot. So in addition to being pushed off our land and forced to, well, not allowed to live on it properly, we're also being threatened. Yeah, perdón.
Entonces, partiendo de todo este panorama, nosotros nunca nos vamos a desistir de nuestras luchas sociales, nunca nos vamos a desistir de siempre exigir el respeto a nuestros territorios, porque ese mismo grito que tienen los pueblos de Amazonia, los pueblos del sur, los pueblos de Patagonia, son el mismo grito que nosotros tenemos aquí, porque nos duele la madre tierra, porque para nosotros es una concepción distinta que para el hombre extranjero, ¿no? Entonces, siempre vamos a estar en pie de lucha y siempre vamos a partir de la filosofía de que si a la tierra se le explota o se le hace algún daño, la tierra tiene que regenerarse, causando estragos sobrenaturales como huracanes, terremotos, y causa de eso nosotros en estos momentos estamos atravesando una ola invernal fuerte aquí en la nación Wayuu.
So what we know is that we're never going to stop fighting. We're demanding respect for our land, for the Amazon, for the south of Latin America, for Patagonia. We demand respect for Mother Earth, and we have a very different belief and feeling for the sacredness of the earth than other foreign groups do. But we're going to fight, and we want the land to regenerate itself. of course, leaving aside things like hurricanes and earthquakes and natural disasters that are going to have their effect, but we want the land to regenerate.
Nosotros estamos conscientes de que estos fenómenos naturales no son al azar. Nosotros estamos conscientes que los fenómenos naturales que nos azotan hoy en día son producto de la sobreexplotación del territorio, no solamente aquí en La Guajira, en el mundo, el calentamiento global, el sobrecalentamiento de los océanos que provocan huracanes. Hoy en día, hace la semana pasada, nosotros no estamos acostumbrados a que nos toquen nuestras costas los huracanes, siempre han sido hacia el norte, pero esta vez nos tocó. Son consecuencias de esa sobreexplotación de la tierra por el hombre.
See, we are totally aware that those natural disasters that I mentioned are not random. They are a result of exploitation of the earth and exploitation of the Guajira region. And the heating of the oceans causes hurricanes and earthquakes. We're used to hurricanes going through where we live. The cyclones go through, but they don't usually come right where we are. But this year, they have come right onto our land.
Bueno, entonces, como siempre nosotros, el pueblo, los originarios, somos los que pagamos las consecuencias. Hoy en día, aquí en La Guajira, a raíz de estas inundaciones, hay más de 700 familias damnificadas que han perdido todo, sus cosechas, sus casas, niños que están en albergues, mientras que los grandes poderes del mundo no saben qué es eso, están en sus comodidades, mientras ellos sigan explotando el territorio. Panoramas como lo que estamos nosotros viviendo aquí en La Guajira lo van a vivir muchos pueblos del mundo costeros que están en estos momentos.
The Wayu people, well, we First Nations people are paying the consequences for what's being done to the earth and the floods that we have just experienced right now. 700 families have lost everything they own. They've lost their homes and children have lost everything they had. And the big powers who caused this, they don't experience any of this hardship and any of this pain, but they just go on exploiting our land and causing these climate effects. Yeah.
Okay. Y bueno, y con esto me despido haciéndoles saber el panorama que nosotros estamos viendo aquí en La Guajira y que nosotros vamos a estar en pie de lucha siempre y que nosotros nunca vamos a echarle la culpa a la naturaleza. Nosotros estamos muy conscientes que la naturaleza tiene que regenerarse, la tierra tiene que regenerarse. Esos cambios climáticos que hoy en día se viven en el mundo son consecuencias del hombre, no de la misma naturaleza. Pero lo que vamos a seguir luchando por eso. Entonces, yo les agradezco desde acá, desde la Nación Wayuu, a todos ustedes por escucharme, por tomarme en cuenta, por tomarnos en cuenta nuestro movimiento.
Now, just saying goodbye to all of you, I just want you to know that we are going to fight. We're not giving up. And we're never going to blame nature for the things that happen to us because we know it's climate change and we know it's the result of activities by human beings who have caused this damage. So thank you for listening to me and a big greeting from the Wayuu people here in Colombia.
Muchas gracias.
Thanks very much.
Shaltomai, Sebastián, muchas gracias. Thank you so much for sharing that information. That is so important, believe me, to talk about what's happening in our continent, to talk about the disasters, that these multinational corporations are causing in our land, how the climate is changing, how governments and states don't listen to the voice of the indigenous people who has been in the land for centuries, protecting the land. So, and at the end, we are going to talk about where people can send support if they want to support, in this case, our Wayuu brother. And as a Mapuche woman, I feel very affected when I hear my brothers, to talk about what's happening also in their land. Lo que estaba diciendo Sebastián es que muchísimas gracias por tu contribución y que realmente para mí me afecta mucho como una mujer mapuche escuchar cómo otros hermanos y hermanas están siendo afectados por estas multinacionales, cómo estas multinacionales destruyen, no solamente nos echan y destruyen nuestra tierra, sino que también están generando este cambio en el clima y que los estados, los gobiernos no nos escuchan, no escuchan la voz del pueblo indígena que ha vivido en la tierra por siglos y que sabemos muy bien cómo cuidarla. Muchísimas gracias por tu contribución, Sebastián. Y ahora voy a invitar a Severino. So I'm going to invite now Severino. Severino is another brother, indigenous leader who agreed to join in this discussion. Severino Charupi, he is the president of Shuar Nation from Pastaza. He is also a member of CONAIE, and his community are fighting oil and mining multinational. So they have a big struggle in front of them. And I would like to welcome Severino and Marie. I'll pass it to you.
Sí, Severino, ya puede empezar, por favor.
¿Listo? Gracias. Buenas noches, hermanos y hermanas, compañeros y compañeras de distintos países.
Good evening and greetings, brothers and sisters and comrades from different countries.
Voy a hablar en la primera parte sobre los daños del extractivismo minero en el Ecuador.
First part, I'd like to talk about the damage that extractivism and mining especially has done in Ecuador.
El Ecuador es un país que tiene 3 regiones, costa, sierra y Amazonía.
Ecuador has 3 regions, one of which is the Amazon region.
Y bueno, Galápagos más lejitos.
That's the furthest one away.
Ya, en la costa, que es la región que está junto al mar, existe minería.
There's mining on the coastal area, which is, yes, the zone, the region of Ecuador beside the sea is where all the mining takes place.
También en la sierra y también en la Amazonía.
Also in the mountains and also in the Amazon zone. So mining in all of those areas.
Ya, para tener un poco de ubicación geográfica, estas 3 regiones se ubican de norte a sur o de sur a norte.
So just to give you a bit of orientation, a bit of geography, these 3 regions run from the north to the south of Ecuador.
En la Amazonía, los principales yacimientos mineros están en el centro-sur amazónico.
In the Amazon zone, the mining fields are in the south or south-central region of the Amazon.
En la sierra están en el sur de la sierra y en el norte de la sierra.
In the mountainous areas, it's both in the north and south.
Y en la costa está ubicado en los subtrópicos, un lugar intermedio entre la sierra y la costa.
And on the coast, it's in the subtropical area, which lies between the mountains and the sea.
Bien, entonces los daños más, bueno, perdón.
No.
En el Ecuador, recién en el 2000, hace 2019, 2017, 2018, 2019, se inaugura la minería metálica a gran escala.
In 2018-19, huge scale mining metal mining started up in Ecuador.
Y ya desde hace media década tenemos minería a pequeña escala.
We've had small scale mining for the last 50 years, but this was huge.
Frente a eso se evidencia algunos daños ya más visibles.
So even more visible damage can be seen now because of that.
En Amazonía Centro, en la provincia de Napo, se están haciendo minería a mediana escala y la contaminación del río Anzu, un río turístico y limpio.
In the Amazon region, in the province of Napo, there's been medium scale mining and you can see serious damage in the river. And this is a beautiful, clean, touristic area, but you can now see the damage.
Si mañana mismo vamos a ver ese río, está con las aguas turbias, oscuras.
If we were to go tomorrow down to that river, you'd see the dirty grey water that's there these days.
En la costa, en el norte de la costa, en el cantón San Lorenzo, hace 2 semanas hubo un derrumbe en donde hay más de 100 desaparecidos y más de una docena de muertos. Justamente la minería a mediana escala.
¿Cuántas personas murieron?
Más de una docena.
On the coast, there was a mine that fell in that was completely, there was just a falling in of the mine and more than 12 people were killed and hundreds of others were injured. This was in San Lorenzo.
Y en el sur de la Amazonía ya está instalado una mina de cielo abierto, en donde que el principal afectado es un río llamado Tundaimi, que es tributario del río Zamora y el río Santiago, que llegan al Marañón.
In the southern Amazon, there's an open cut mine, and it's right beside the 2 rivers, the Rio David, which is part of the Zamora and Santiago, they're tributary, it's a tributary of the Zamora and Santiago River.
Esos 3 ejemplos que he puesto son evidentes en una minería que recién está empezando. ¿Y qué pasaría y qué diríamos más adelante?
Those 3 examples I gave you is just part of this big project that's just starting. So what's going to happen in the future?
Bueno, ahí podemos ver que hay una alta contaminación ambiental en cuanto a los ríos.
You can see from what I said that there's a high level of contamination in our rivers.
También los daños son directos, como el caso de derrumbe, en donde hay gente muerta.
You can also see such direct damage as those people who were killed that I just mentioned.
Y también persecución a los líderes y luchadores sociales a través de judicialización y también asesinatos.
There's also strong persecution of social leaders and people who try to change things, including they're being criminalized and sent to prison and also even being killed.
También se tiene un alto porcentaje de desunión en las familias y en las comunidades donde están asentados los proyectos mineros.
It also causes a lot of disunity and fragmentation in the families involved in the areas where the mining's going on.
Hay muchos daños que todavía no conocemos, como por ejemplo el daño a los insectos, a los reptiles, a las plantas, que no está cuantificado todavía.
There's also a lot of damage that we haven't even yet been able to gauge. damage to the insect life and the growth of plants in the area where the mine is operating.
Especialmente en la cordillera del Cóndor, en la provincia de Zamora Chinchipe, donde que están haciendo minería a cielo abierto, porque es una zona de alta biodiversidad.
Especially in the mountain range, which is in the north, which is an area of extreme diversity, biodiversity, and those mines in that mountain are doing tremendous damage.
Respecto a campañas de solidaridad y apoyo, en estos tiempos no hemos tenido no ha sido muy visible estas campañas. Ahorita ya estoy hablando de la segunda parte.
As far as solidarity and support goes, just recently it's been really clear to us. We've been able to see solidarity, so I want to talk to you about that in the second part.
Puedo contarles una acción de solidaridad y apoyo que vivimos en el 2016 frente a la militarización del Estado ecuatoriano en la provincia de Morona, Santiago.
I want to tell you about an example of solidarity and support that took place in 2018 after the militarization of an area of, ¿cómo se llama el lugar? Santiago.
Morona, Santiago.
Morón de Santiago. So that there was militarization of that area, Morón de Santiago. Gracias.
En el 2016 teníamos en el Ecuador el gobierno de Rafael Correa, un gobierno que era bastante controlador de todos los poderes del Estado.
In 2016, we had a president in Ecuador, Rafael Correa, who was controlling and looking to control the power of the state.
Él empujó una fuerte política minera.
He sí apoyó una fuerte política minera. ¿Sí? He supported a strong mining policy of mining. Perdón, sí.
En donde que hubieron comunidades que hicieron fuerte resistencia.
¿Hicieron qué?
Fuerte, una resistencia bien fuerte.
Yeah, there were communities whose existence was threatened.
Pero fue bastante difícil porque el gobierno nacional decretó un estado de excepción en toda la provincia de Morona, Santiago.
But the government declared a state of exception in the whole region of Morón, Santiago.
Desplegando cerca de 8,000 efectivos entre policías y militares para controlar una comunidad de 30 familias, de 30 personas.
They unleashed 8,000 both mixture of police and military forces on a community made up of 30 people.
Entonces ahí las organizaciones indígenas tuvimos que hacer una campaña de cartas hacia el mismo gobierno y hacia las empresas nacionales, transnacionales, para que vean de que su presencia estaba haciendo daño en el territorio ecuatoriano.
So the First Nations organizations got together and we ran a campaign. We sent many letters to the local government, to the national government, pressuring for this to stop. Yeah.
También hubo una unidad fuerte de parte de las organizaciones indígenas.
There was serious unity amongst the indigenous groupings.
Finalmente el gobierno judicializó, pero no pudo capturar a los compañeros indígenas porque se ocultaron en la selva.
In the end, the government tried to criminalize the indigenous people, but they couldn't arrest them because they hid in the jungles.
Entonces, para nosotros, en una campaña de solidaridad y apoyo, es bien importante la organización y el territorio que nos permite ocultarnos.
So for us, in a campaign of solidarity, one of the really critical things is to have an area where you can hide yourself and move to that area.
Por eso, para nosotros es bien importante la lucha, el territorio y la organización. Muchas gracias.
For us, the real issues, what's critical is the struggle, land, and to be organized. Thank you very much. Terminaste, ¿cierto? Sí. Thanks very much. He had finished his talk.
Yeah, no, después vienen las preguntas, Severino, y también para Sebastián, para que no se vayan. Y ahora vamos a tener a nuestro hermano, Hugo. So what I was saying to the other speakers not to leave, because we are hoping that all of you who are listening through the Facebook or who are here with us today to ask some questions. So our final speaker for today that I'm going to introduce is Hugo Takuri. He's an indigenous leader from the Indigenous People Confederation of Peru, who was speaking before, but he had a few technical issues. We were unable really to hear properly what he was saying. So Hugo and Marie Dolora is going to help with the translation. So Hugo, can you hear me? Hugo, ¿me puedes escuchar? Hugo.
Sí, sí le escucho, hermana Marisol.
Y ahora suena muy bien.
Bien.
Sí, ahora suena súper clarito. Entonces le dejo para que, 15 minutos, hermano, para que usted nos explique lo que está pasando y al final siempre es bueno que mencione si es que hay alguna campaña o si necesitan dinero, cómo podemos apoyar, ¿ya?
Bien, muchas gracias.
Ya pues.
Bueno,
All right,
bueno, nuevamente mi saludo a todos los hermanos presentes en esta reunión virtual y mis felicitaciones a los organizadores, a las MEC y a los hermanos mapuches que radican ahí en Australia. Nuestra solidaridad pues, con el pueblo originario de Australia por el atropello del gobierno de turno allí de la Victoria. Realmente, escuchando a nuestros hermanos de Ecuador y de Colombia, se podría decir que aquí en América Latina el problema es común, es igual.
¿Puedo interrumpir?
En uno más y en otro menos, ¿no?
Sí. Very difficult to hear. I'm really sorry. It's so hard to make out what Hugo is saying, but he said that once again he wanted to greet everybody and he wanted to thank the people in Australia and to greet the Mapuche people, and he wanted to mention the action by the state of Victoria against the Japurong people and the sacred trees. But I'm sorry, creo que perdí algo porque no oigo muy bien. Entra un sonido que destroza el sonido.
Sí.
Bien, entonces el problema de nuestros pueblos.
Hugo, tú puedes a lo mejor bajarle un poco.
Escucha, hermana Marisol.
Bajarle un poquitito el volumen, porque cuando puede que a lo mejor tiene demasiado volumen.
A ver, vamos a ver.
Porque viste ahora cuando tú hablas no está el ruido, pero después cuando te pones a hablar aparece el ruido.
Bien. Bien,
ahí sí se escucha bien, hermano.
Bien, hermano, lo voy a tener en la mano, entonces con el celular no me voy a trabajar. Como decía...
Perdón, sí.
Bien, como decía, el problema es común en nuestros pueblos de aquí, de América del Sur, y podríamos decir de que este problema de nuestros pueblos empieza desde la llegada de los occidentales, de hace casi 5 siglos, aquí en América del Sur y en América más de 5 siglos, ¿no?
So you could say that there's a really common problem here in South America, and this problem began really when Europeans arrived here 500 years ago. Ya, gracias.
Y desde esa fecha, pues, tenemos la invasión de estos hermanos occidentales, quienes por la riqueza, más que nada por el oro y la plata, estuvieron aquí y su llegada no ha sido nada pacífica, sino han llegado, pues, matando, violando, desapareciendo a los originarios de esta zona de nuestro país, del sur, de América del Sur.
So from that time on, those people came here from Western European people looking for gold, looking for wealth, looking for silver. And their arrival here was not peaceful in any way at all. They came killing and raping and damaging, and that has been their effect on the First Nations people here. Yeah.
Aquí en el Perú de manera especial tenemos dos minas que tienen más de 2 siglos, casi 3 siglos de existencia, y nada bueno ha contribuido al desarrollo de estos dos pueblos. Me refiero a la región de Huancavelica y de Cerro de Pasco.
Here in Peru, there are 2 mines that have been here for 200 or 300 years, and these mines have never contributed anything to the people living in the region around where the mine is. They are in Huancavelica and another town, which have been completely exploited. Sí.
Y la más recordada, podría decir, de aquí en el siglo XX, a inicios del siglo XXI, ha sido la mina Yanacocha.
The mine that really stays in everyone's mind from the end of 20th and start of the 21st century is the mine of Yanacocha.
Con todos los recursos naturales metálicos, vamos a decirlo así, el Perú se encuentra dentro de los 5 primeros de exportación de oro y plata, de oro de manera especial a nivel mundial. Dentro de 5 países a nivel del mundo estamos considerados.
Peru is considered in the top 5 countries as regards mining. We in the top 5 countries in the amount of gold, mostly gold, but also silver that we have in our country.
Y en el aspecto de América del Sur, somos uno de los primeros a nivel de América del Sur en la exportación de oro y número 1 en la exportación de plata y otros minerales en segundo, en tercer lugar, ¿no?
We are number 1 exporters of gold for all of South America and also for silver.
A pesar de esa inmensa riqueza que hay en el país, nuestros pueblos originarios, tanto andinos, amazónicos y de costa, similar a los hermanos de Ecuador, viven en la miseria, en la pobreza, excluidos, marginados, y realmente no hay un Estado que los reconozca como tal.
Despite this huge wealth that I've mentioned, the First Nations people in the Andean regions, in the Amazon region, live in absolute misery and total poverty. They're excluded from society. They're totally marginalized, despite all that wealth in their lands. Yeah.
Como un pequeño ejemplo nada más, les voy a leer, aquí dice, en el país, en el Perú, en 21 años de operaciones, de 1993 al 2003, Yanacocha ha llegado a extraer del subsuelo nada menos que 34.129.000 onzas de oro.
Just to give you a small example, in Peru, over the 21 years of mining, the Yanacocha mine from 1993 to 2003, they have mined up 34 million, dijiste que 34 mil millones de, perdón, ¿puedes repetir la cantidad?
34.129.170 onzas.
So 34,159,000 ounces of gold have been dug up from this mine. Gracias.
Y en la exportación de plata ya también es más de 37 millones de extracción de oro, ¿no?
And, perdón, más de oro o de plata.
Más de 37 millones de extracción de plata.
More than 37 million in the extract of silver. extraction of silver. ¿Cómo así que 27 millones de onzas? De plata.
onzas, exacto, sí.
Sorry,
Sí,
I
de plata,
misunderstood.
30.
37 million ounces of silver in addition. More than 37 ounces of silver have been mined.
Haciendo un cálculo matemático en dólares, vendría a ser más o menos algo de 50,000 millones de dólares.
If you want to calculate that in dollars, it's more than $50 billion.
Entonces, la minería en nuestros pueblos originarios no ha contribuido a nada. Solamente lo que han enriquecido es a las transnacionales.
So mining for us, First Nations people, has not contributed anything whatever. The people who've got super rich are the multinational companies that come here to mine.
Esto es a consecuencia de las constituciones que tenemos en nuestros países, que lejos de ser una constitución política, es como si fuera un reglamento interno de saqueo de los recursos naturales aquí en el Perú de manera precisa.
This is the result of the constitutions that we have in our countries. Rather than a legislative constitution, it's a plan for robbers. It's a rule to set up a plan for robbers to steal what we have.
Nosotros los pueblos indígenas en el Perú no estamos considerados como tal en la constitución política.
We, the First Nations people of Peru, we do not feature in the political constitution of the country.
Nos reconocen como comunidades campesinas y comunidades nativas de la Amazonía. Esto con la finalidad de no reconocer nuestros derechos como pueblos indígenas.
We are recognized and called, in inverted commas, peasants or rural workers, and also classified as natives of the Amazon, and we are not given respect or our rights.
Gracias a los trabajos que se ha realizado el Convenio 169, la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas y de la OEA, hemos ganado bastante espacio en ese aspecto sobre el reconocimiento a los pueblos indígenas.
Thanks to Clause 169 from the United Nations, Declaration of the United Nations and the Organization of American States work, we have gained some ground in the way of recognition of us and our rights.
Aquí en el Perú, a los pueblos indígenas, como no son reconocidos, no les permiten de que una comunidad, un pueblo originario, solicite el derecho a la consulta libre, previa e informada, porque no es comunidad indígena, sino es catalogado como comunidad campesina.
So since we're not officially recognized, the First Nations people, when they run consultations, nationwide consultations on what should happen, we're not allowed to give our opinions because we're classified, as I mentioned, as natives of the Amazon or country people or rural workers. So we're not classified as First Nations people.
Entonces, lo que podríamos decir es de que rescato la participación de un hermano que me antecedió, donde decía de que tenemos que estar unidos, y estoy totalmente de acuerdo con eso, de que nosotros debemos de unir nuestros pueblos de Ecuador, de Bolivia, de Perú, de Chile, de Argentina, de todos los pueblos de América del Sur y toda América, y por qué no decir del mundo, para que así de esa manera hagamos respetar nuestros derechos.
And I want to really repeat and emphasize what my brother said a little bit earlier today, which is that we need to get unified. We need unity. And I see that the First Nations people of Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, all of the Americas, we need to be unified. Why not say the whole world? We need unity to support each other.
Lo digo como antecedente tenemos de que nos encontramos en un tiempo distinto, estamos quizás de repente en lo que nuestros abuelos tenían la profecía de estar en el Pachacutic, de estar en el tiempo del Incarri, estar en una nueva era, y creo que eso va a ser muy positivo para nuestros pueblos.
We find ourselves right now in a different time. There was a prophecy from our ancestors of the Pachacuti, and I think that we are moving into a new era, and we're thinking it's going to be very positive for us.
El Pachacuti quiere decir el retorno al bien. Y el Incarri quiere decir de que volveré y seré millones. Nos juntaremos y volveremos y seremos millones.
So there are two prophecies, as I mentioned, the Pachacute, which means we will come back and we'll flourish, and the Incarik, which means there'll be thousands of us and we'll come back strongly.
Es un claro ejemplo de lo que está sucediendo en América del Sur. El país hermano de Bolivia, después de un año de interrupción del gobierno del hermano Evo Morales, volvieron a retomar nuevamente el poder. Entonces, esto quiere decir de que nuestros pueblos, empezando desde el Collasuyo, o mejor dicho, Bolivia, están volviendo a renacer, a estar dentro de donde tenía que estar nuestros pueblos, ¿no? Entonces, este ejemplo va a ser, estoy seguro de que seguirá el camino los hermanos de Ecuador, porque están más organizados. En el Perú seguramente será después, por el hecho de que aquí todavía no estamos bien organizados, por el simple hecho de que el querer ser blanco es muy grande aquí. La colonización mental es muy grande aquí en el Perú.
So, the good news from Bolivia, after 1 year in the wilderness, the party of Evo Morales has come back once again. And that is a really good sign for everybody else. And Collasuyo, or what we call Collasuyo Bolivia, has come back to life. It's really back to where it should have been. And we believe we are going to come back to where we should be. And Ecuador, I think, will follow in the path of the way Bolivia has gone back to Evo Morales' party. Peru will be a little bit slower, I think, because in our country, we're not well organized. And also, there's too much of a desire to be like white people and to move into their culture. So we don't want that to go ahead. Yeah. Gracias.
Me refiero a Bolivia en el aspecto de que es un gobierno del pueblo para el pueblo, un gobierno indígena. Y sucederá lo mismo en Ecuador y posteriormente en el Perú. ¿Por qué lo digo esto? Porque la mayoría de la población, somos más del 60 o 70 o 80% de la población en estos tres países mencionados, de pueblos indígenas.
The reason I am speaking so well about the government of Bolivia, that it's a government by the people, for the people. It's a First Nations government. And in Ecuador and later Peru, the reason I mention those two is that for those three countries, over 60%, between 60 and 80% of the population are First Nations people, and they deserve to have their rights respected. Ya, gracias.
Finalmente, una vez más, muchas gracias por estar con ustedes, hermanos de otros. Sabemos muy bien de que nosotros somos fuertes. Las hojas nos corten nuestras ramas, así nos corten el tronco, jamás podrán cortar nuestras raíces. Muchísimas gracias, hermanos y hermanas, por haberme escuchado.
Thank you very much. We know that we are strong people, and even if they try and cut some of our branches and leaves, they will never get to the trunk. They just cannot get rid of the roots, and we are strongly here. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Thank you very much, Sebastián. Thank you very much, Severino. So, and now probably we can open for questions or comments. So we have Joy, and also we have Marian. So Joy, do we have questions? Well, your microphone is off, Joy, just letting you know. There you are.
Yeah, if I can just type it. What, in the light of what the speakers have said, there was mention of the importance of unity. What challenges are there in achieving unity?
Who are you asking, Joe?
All, any who want to.
La pregunta de Joe es para cualquier de los tres discursantes y pregunta cuáles son los desafíos que se enfrentan ustedes cuando buscan la unidad. ¿Qué es lo que lo vuelve difícil? Unirse.
Bueno, si me permiten, puedo dar una pequeña respuesta.
If you let me reply, I'll be happy to reply. Sí, claro.
Bien, los desafíos que tenemos es de manera principal acá en el Perú es de que como estamos colonizados mentalmente, es un poco difícil que podemos volver o autoidentificarnos como tal. Esa es una dificultad que nos atañe a nosotros. Y de repente podríamos decir también es la parte económica para poder hacer alguna socialización o sensibilización a nuestros pueblos.
First challenge I would mention is that we have been mentally colonized. We've really been taken over, and it's very difficult for us to look for our own identity, for self-esteem and so on. Second issue I would want to mention is the economic issue, because you need funds to reach out and train and socialize your people. Gracias. ¿Alguien más quiere hablar de eso? Sí, Sebastián, sí.
Bueno, yo voy a hablar desde la perspectiva de donde nosotros estamos. Nosotros pensamos que los pueblos indígenas somos como las presas para los leones, y los leones saben cuáles son las debilidades. Por ejemplo, los leones buscan las presas más débiles. En este caso, las transnacionales dividen de esa forma. Buscan familias o líderes que estén, no vamos a mentir, siempre hay un líder o un indígena que está buscando una forma de ganar dinero. Y entonces ahí es donde ellos llegan y eso lo utilizan como una herramienta de dividir la posición de uno. Entonces
claro.
salen
sí.
dinero por delante.
Claro. We think that First Nations people, in a way, are the prey of the lions. When I say the prey of the lions, I mean that big multinational companies analyze our weaknesses. They know to look, and what they do is they look for families or leaders of our peoples who are interested in, and they divide us. So there are always people who can be offered money and who will then bring about divisions in the community. Gracias. That was Sebastian's idea. Thanks. Adelante. Sorry.
I have two more questions here, if that's all right.
Joy Severino is going to speak.
Oh, sorry, yes, sorry. No.
Ya, los indígenas tenemos dos desafíos en mi modo de ver. El primer desafío es entender que dentro de los indígenas no somos enemigos, somos nosotros mismos. Ese es el primer desafío.
We have two challenges we face, and the first thing we need to understand is that we, Indigenous First Nations people, we are not enemies of each other. We're not each other's enemies.
Y el segundo desafío, que para mí es el más importante, es lograr esa unidad real entre el campo y la ciudad, la ruralidad y la urbanidad, y la unidad del mestizo y del indígena.
The second big challenge I see is managing unity between people who live in the urban regions and people who live in the countryside. And the second part of that is unity to be brought about between First Nations people and mixed race people. Gracias.
Y finalmente, ya.
Sí.
Ya, y finalmente, entender que este problema no es un tema étnico, sino es un problema concreto económico.
And we need to understand this is not an ethnic problem. It's a concrete economic financial problem.
Gracias.
Thanks very much.
Joy?
Okay, the next question again to all three speakers is what is from Andy. What is the origin of the desire to be white, and why is it so prevalent?
Esta pregunta es de Andy y es para todos los tres. Quien quiera contestarlo, y es de dónde viene ese deseo de ser blanco, o sea, deseo de ser parte del grupo blanco en el país. Sí, Sebastián.
Bueno, eso tiene un origen que parte de la misma colonización.
This comes
Cuando
from the
empiezan
original colonization.
Cuando empiezan a colonizar la mente de los indígenas, de que el ser indígena era bajo, no era bueno, sino que el ser blanco era, cuando hablaban de raza superior, que eran más inteligentes, la belleza física. Entonces ya eso viene cultivándose ya en los internados que vinieron a implementarse en los territorios. Y después de eso ya viene con la discriminación. Cuando un indígena llega a las grandes ciudades, lo señalan de ser pobre, lo señalan de ser ignorante, lo señalan de ser feo. Entonces, eso contrae que el mismo indígena se autodiscrimine. Entonces, quiera ser parte de la otra sociedad que supuestamente es la mejor. O sea, ya es como un daño psicológico que ya traen a los individuos de las naciones originarias.
Gracias. This comes back, this desire to be white comes back to the colonization of people's minds. The First Nations people are painted as being low, not good enough, and it's considered that white people are superior, they're more intelligent, and they have more physical beauty. And this was drummed into our people in the boarding schools where they were taught, and then it moves on to discrimination against First Nations people. And people are considered, when they arrive in the big cities, First Nations people are considered ugly, poor, and ignorant. And we get to the point where we discriminate against ourselves because we start to believe that narrative that they put forward. And this, then our people want to be part of that so-called superior grouping in society. And this is, gracias.
¿Yo?
Great, not
Sí.
She'll wash it for you.
Eh,
You will, but like, hard to know.
Severino, ¿sí?
Sí. El tema del blanqueamiento es un problema histórico de exclusión, marginación, explotación hacia el indígena, en donde que...
Perdona. This issue of the longing to be white is a problem of exclusion, of being marginalized, and of being exploited.
En donde que el ser indígena era lo último, el sucio, el vago, el borracho, el pobre, el apestoso, el que no sabía, el demonio. Entonces, por eso es que nuestros jóvenes preferían parecerse blancos para no tener esa discriminación.
The prevailing, the way we were painted, First Nations people, is that we were dirty, lazy, drunken, poor, smelly, ignorant, basically the devil. And our young people started to aspire to be white because they don't want to fit into that terrible discriminating category.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Bueno, hermana Mari, le doy ¿qué les digo? Estoy de acuerdo con la participación de nuestros dos hermanos que me antecedieron. En aquel tiempo de la invasión, pues el racismo ha sido muy fuerte y el originario quiso ser como el invasor. Eso ha sido el problema de querer ser blanco. Muchas gracias.
I agree with my two brothers. Since the invasion, there has been massive racism, a very strong racism. And First Nations people then have wanted to identify with the invaders. So thank you very much. Gracias.
Okay, one more question from Andy. Is there a future without extractivism, if I pronounced it rightly? What are the technological challenges and what might this future, if there is one like that, look like?
Otra pregunta para todo el mundo, creo. Andy otra vez, y él pregunta, ¿hay un futuro sin extravismo? ¿Cuáles serán los problemas tecnológicos o cuál será el desafío del futuro si abandonamos el extravismo?
Yeah. Sebastián.
A ver, hermana María.
El desafío, bueno, el desafío para todos los pueblos indígenas creo que es mantenerse en los principios de nuestros abuelos, de nuestros ancestros, mantener el equilibrio entre la naturaleza y el hombre. Eso, mantener esa noción de la conexión con lo humano y lo no humano, con la espiritualidad, mantener esa naturaleza que nos caracteriza a nosotros en un mundo globalizado, con tecnologías nuevas, donde todo está a la vuelta de la esquina. Mantener esa naturaleza humana, ese es el desafío que enfrentan nosotros los pueblos indígenas del mundo, ya sea de Brasil, de Argentina, nosotros los guayú, que a pesar de las nuevas tecnologías, que las nuevas tendencias del futuro, nosotros podamos combinar eso con nuestra naturaleza cultural.
I think the challenge for all First Nations people is to stick to our principles and stick to our philosophies, stick to the cultural truths of our grandparents, of our ancestors, of our parents, find that balance between nature and the people, a balance between humanity, what is human and what is not human, our spirituality, and really our own identity as First Nations people. And this challenge exists in this globalized world of instant gratification. The First Nations people of Brazil, Argentina, the people, the YU people, face this huge challenge. But despite all of this new technology, I believe we can find a balance and continue our own cultural ways.
A ver, hermana Mari, tengo entendido de que sin extractivismo podemos vivir. Tenemos un claro ejemplo de la Confederación del Tahuantinsuyo, que anteriormente eran los pueblos de Ecuador, Bolivia, Perú, Colombia, Argentina, Chile. Entonces, en ese tiempo no había el extractivismo. Entonces ahí vivían mejor que vivimos ahora en esta actualidad. Entonces el punto es eso, ¿no? Vivir en armonía con la naturaleza, como lo dijo el hermano que me antecedió. El problema de nosotros, me parece, es de que estamos siguiendo vamos a decirlo así, el modelo occidental del consumismo. Ahí está nuestro problema. Tenemos algo, queremos volver a tener más de lo que tenemos. Entonces, eso no es la concepción filosófica de nuestros pueblos originarios. Muchas gracias.
I believe that
Yeah.
we lived better back with Tiwantitsuyo. The people of Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, before extractivism came to us. We lived in harmony with nature and we lived better, as I said. And I think that by following the Western model and being drawn into consumerism, it's damaging us. We don't need to do that. Thank you very much.
Ya, yo.
Severino.
A ver.
Sí, adelante.
Creo que sí, debemos buscar un equilibrio entre el ser indígena y el no ser indígena. Porque quedarnos en el solo ser indígena, creo que no es un radicalismo extremo, o también pasarnos a creer solo ser blanco, ¿no es cierto? Valorar toda la fuera también es otro extremo. Sí creo que debe haber un cambio profundo y radical en el mundo, no solo del extractivismo, para poder existir como especie humana. Y en ese sentido, bueno, hasta ahí.
I think we need to reach a balance, and we can't just say, okay, First Nations people only and leave out non-First Nations people. We can't have such a radical Indigenous approach, but we also can't just go to white culture and white approaches to things either. So what we need is a big change in this world, not just a change to extractivism. We need a change, and we need to operate like human beings, the way people should live.
Debemos preguntarnos.
Quisiera agregar. Sí.
Sí,
sí, hermano, siga.
Sí, debemos preguntarnos para qué los minerales. Porque, por ejemplo, el tema del cobre, que es el conductor, uno de los metales que es más utilizado a nivel mundial para la conducción de la energía. Entonces, ahí tenemos que hacer grandes preguntas. ¿El oro para qué? ¿El cobre para qué? ¿No es cierto? ¿O el uranio para qué? Entonces...
Perdón. We have to ask ourselves, so what do we really want these minerals for? Copper is a conductor. It's a great conductor of energy, but why do we really want copper? Why do we need it? And the same with gold. What do we want gold for? And also uranium. Why do we want to dig it up? Sí, perdona, ¿quieres seguir?
Sí, bueno, eso creo que a las cosas en el mundo hay que darles el valor de uso, ¿no? Y yo creo que sí se requiere de cierta minería, por ejemplo, si es que, pero dándole valor de uso, que justamente sea para la reproducción del ser humano, pero no para la reproducción del capitalismo.
I think you've really got to say, what is the real value of these minerals? Do we really, if they are really valuable, if we're going to really use them, if they're useful for people to reproduce and useful for people, okay. But if they're just for making money, we don't need them.
Yep. Entonces ahora, Hugo, ¿terminaste, Severino?
Último, entonces finalmente quienes deben decidir no debe ser ni el Estado ni los empresarios. Quienes deben decidir sobre ese tema deben ser los trabajadores, las trabajadoras y los indígenas, el pueblo.
I just want to end up by saying that the people making decisions about this, it shouldn't be the state and it shouldn't be big business. It should be the workers and First Nations people who make the decisions.
Gracias, Severino. Hugo.
Bien, gracias, hermana Marisol. Lo que quería agregar al respecto es donde el hermano Severino toca de que no podemos ser radicales, no podemos quedarnos como indígenas nada más. Entonces, allí yo quisiera decir esto al respecto, de que nuestros abuelos han trabajado con el complemento, con la complementariedad. Entonces, pienso yo de que en este siglo XXI en el que nos encontramos, debemos de recoger todo lo bueno que hicieron nuestros abuelos. Hay que rescatar todo lo positivo y también rescatar todo lo positivo de este siglo XXI. Entonces, complementaríamos con eso, lo pasado, lo presente para el futuro. Y eso sería, creo, lo correcto para nuestros pueblos. Porque cuando digo complemento, quiero decir de que el hombre y la mujer se complementan. El calor y el frío se complementan. Esa es la complementariedad, lo negativo, lo positivo. Entonces, ahora podríamos decir en este aspecto de que lo pasado con el presente para el futuro. Muchas gracias.
I just wanted to add to what my brother Severino said, that when he said that we can't just be radically indigenous and that's all, what I wanted to say is that our ancestors worked hard and they did a huge amount of good and they provided complementarity to what was going on. They made huge contributions and they worked hard over the past, and we should be reaping the benefits in the 21st century of the work that they did. And I see, when I say complementarity, I mean men and women complement each other, hot and cold complement each other, and the past and the present and the future should complement each other. And I think that we have to use the good of the past for the future of our people.
Muchas gracias, Hugo. Thank you very much, Hugo, Severino, and Sebastián. Any more questions, Joy?
No more
Marian?
questions.
I saw
They had one more.
something about,
Where was?
yeah.
There was a question about how to overcome technological challenges, but perhaps that's already been addressed by the speakers.
Yeah, that was in the last question.
Yeah.
All right. I have a question. If no one else has a question from.
Sorry, there is one more question from Andy. It is, ¿qué es belleza desde una perspectiva indígena? What is beauty from an indigenous perspective?
Ah, yes.
Sí, Andy, perdón. Sí, Andy tenía una última pregunta que era, ¿cómo se define la belleza desde un punto de vista indígena o cómo explican la belleza? ¿Cómo lo explican? Porque antes hablábamos de belleza.
Bueno, dentro de la variedad de culturas indígenas en Latinoamérica, me imagino que cada quien tendrá su perspectiva acerca de la belleza. En este caso voy a hablar desde mi perspectiva como indígena wayú. En mi cultura la belleza la miden a través de la generosidad y la humildad del ser humano. Mientras la persona sea más humilde con el otro, más generoso con el otro, todo lo tiende a ver una persona hermosa, bella. Entonces, creo que la belleza para mí es eso. Y también desde mi perspectiva personal, la belleza también la mediría a través del saber. La persona mientras más sepa, para mí es más atractiva.
With all the cultural varieties that exist across Indigenous people, First Nations people in Latin America, I'm sure they've all got their own perspectives on what they consider beauty to be, but I'll give you my own perspective as a YU person. And I believe that beauty for me is a person who is generous. Generosity, humility, that's beautiful to me. And a person who shows generosity to others, I find that very beautiful. The other aspect that I find very beautiful is knowledge. I find knowledge very attractive. So people who are very knowledgeable attract me.
¿Yo?
Sí, sí, sí.
La belleza desde la visión indígena ecuatoriana tiene que, se ve reflejada en elementos objetivos para la construcción de la vida. No es una cuestión muy subjetiva. Y es por eso de que la belleza se expresa en la forma como te pintas el rostro, en la forma como cantas, en la forma como cocinas un alimento, en la forma como tejes elaboras un material, en la forma como cuidas a un ser humano. Entonces son elementos concretos para que dan característica a la belleza. En la forma de si es que eres una mujer, si tienes el cuerpo bien grande para poder tener hijos, para reproducir la vida, entonces no es la belleza solo muy física, sino son elementos concretos para la vida humana.
I think through the Ecuadorian vision, beauty is, it's an objective thing. It's not a totally subjective thing, not left to just subjective aspects. I think there are many angles of beauty, how you paint your face, how well you sing, can you cook a beautiful dinner, can you weave textiles, and how you look after other people. And in women, a woman has a big body, can have a lot of children, that's a beautiful thing, but it's all different aspects of beauty.
Gracias, Severino. Thank you, Severino. ¿Quiere alguien más hacer un comentario? Hugo, ¿quiere responder esa pregunta? ¿O la pasas?
Bueno, quizás cortito nada más.
I'll be short.
Cada pueblo tiene su forma de interpretar la belleza. Yo creo que lo dejo ahí nada más. Muchas gracias.
I'll be really short on this one. I think that all different peoples and groups interpret beauty in their own way. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. We are getting to the end of the session. We still have a few minutes. If there is more questions, please, this is the time for you to ask those questions. And at the end, of course, we have some information. I have two questions that I want to ask at the last minute. So I think, Marian, I saw your hand up.
Oh, no, sorry, yeah, just to pass on the information, but go ahead.
All right. So do we have more questions? Nothing through the chat. We don't have no one looking the Facebook because our friend Apsara.
No, there's nothing. I've been looking.
No, nothing? No, nothing through the Facebook. So
there was one comment made. There's another question and a comment from Andy A. We can take it as a comment if maybe we'll put another person's question because Andy has had a lot of questions. So it says generosity exploited by the individualistic West. Catastrophic combination. It says, in the face of destruction, how to remain loving rather than resort to anger. But maybe we could take that as a comment if someone else would like to add another question.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I can put in a question, which a topic hasn't been mentioned today. The
Marisol had a question.
No. Leave mines are at
Yeah, I
the
thought
last
you wanted
minute.
to, yeah. And this is to know specifically, does the situation, the changing political situation in the United States, does that have an impact on your situation?
Joy tiene una pregunta y quiere saber si los cambios políticos en Estados Unidos, o sea, la situación que está cambiando en este mismo momento en Estados Unidos, si eso tendrá algún efecto en la situación de ustedes.
Sí. ¿Quién quiere responder primero? ¿Entendieron la pregunta? ¿Sebastián?
Sí. Sí, es una pregunta relativa. Una pregunta relativa porque para nadie es un secreto que los Estados Unidos manejan un sistema a nivel internacional de explotación, de capitalismo. Ellos no van a cambiar su modelo de noche a la mañana. Entonces, solo que difiere un poco es la intensidad. Y Colombia y los Estados Unidos tienen una alianza de años. Para mí, personalmente, no creo que haya mucho cambio para los indígenas en Latinoamérica con un nuevo gobierno en los Estados Unidos. Si hay, bueno, serán muy esporádicos o muy por encima.
I think that's really relative. The United States has a big international policy of exploiting other countries and exploiting the world. And that is, I don't see that changing at all. It might get a little bit less intense with this new government, but it's not going to change much. And Colombia has an alliance with the United States and has had for years. And so I don't see much change for First Nations people with this new government in the United States. If there is any change, it's going to be patchy and superficial, basically, I think.
Y tenemos a alguien más, Severino, Hugo, ¿quieren responder esa pregunta? Severino, ¿ya?
Sí, los temas más centrales del dominio norteamericano no van a cambiar, como el tema de la expansión económica, el tema de lo militar y el control mundial no van a cambiar, ¿no? Entonces son algo que no depende de la llegada de un presidente, sino de una revolución interna en el país. Entonces, lo que sí va a ser un poco más tinosos en las relaciones, con un poco de más diplomacia, sí, ¿no es cierto? Eso sí.
I think that the most central aspects of the United States, their desire for economic expansion, their militarization, it's not going to change. And this doesn't really depend on electing a new person as government. It depends on an internal revolution in the United States. But perhaps this new government will be slightly more diplomatic and, yes, approachable than the one before.
Hola, hermana. A ver, si me permiten. Bueno, yo también tengo la misma percepción de que no va a cambiar nada en el aspecto político, económico, parte con este nuevo gobierno que va a ser Estados Unidos. Sería muy breve en ese aspecto.
I have exactly the same point of view, the same belief that economically, politically, absolutely nothing's going to change. So I can be really brief in this one.
My apologies, my dog was crying to get into the house. I know. All right, so do you have any other question?
Nope.
No question. So I would like to ask a question, if everyone agree with that. I would like to ask how we can help, the campaigns you have against extractivism from here, from Australia. And I'll be happy if you can send some information also through the chat, just to see if there is any other participants. Happy also to support. And I like a lot the idea of organizing a unity between First Nations. Lo que digo es que mi pregunta, a mí me gustaría saber cómo nosotros podemos apoyar sus campañas desde acá, desde Australia. Y bueno, también las personas que hoy día nos están escuchando. Y si pueden enviar alguna información por intermedio del chat, creo que sería bueno. Pero me gustaría saber cómo podemos ayudarlos para apoyar esas campañas en contra del extractivismo. Sebastián.
Bueno, en estos momentos, aquí en La Guajira, nosotros estamos emprendiendo, no va directamente contra el extractivismo, sino contra los efectos del extractivismo, porque nosotros en estos momentos estamos viviendo una calamidad humana por el azote del paso del huracán. Entonces estamos viviendo una difícil situación, por lo menos en el pueblo indígena donde yo estoy. Hay 700 familias damnificadas. Afortunadamente, muchas organizaciones, muchas les están dando apoyo a ellos, pero hay otro sector que está en la Alta Guajira, que se le dice que es un sector muy retirado de la zona urbana, que prácticamente a ellos no se les va a llegar nada. Entonces, desde nuestro movimiento, nuestra campaña de solidaridad con ellos es cómo ver la fórmula de que nosotros podamos adquirir alimentos, ropa, zapatos para esas personas que están allá. Porque los que están aquí en el perímetro urbano, no les voy a decir mentiras, están recibiendo apoyo aparte de otras organizaciones. Entonces, otra vez con el apoyo de LASNET y de Lucho, estamos emprendiendo esa campaña de solidaridad con el pueblo indígena.
Here in the Guajira right now, we're not directly fighting extractivism itself right at this moment. We're fighting the effects on people of extractivism. What I mean is there's just been a terrible hurricane and it's very difficult for people. My First Nations people, many organizations are trying to help, but in the highlands where the Guajira live, in the highest regions, those people up in the highlands don't get any help because they are remote and distant from the urban areas. And so we need to send clothes and shoes because they've lost everything. In the urban region, we are getting help. There is help in it. People living closer to cities, and some organizations are helping us. And thank you very much to Lucho and Lasnet for helping us. But we would like to ask for help for those people in remote areas that are not getting the support they need.
Yo.
Gracias.
Severino. Gracias, Sebastián.
Sí, bueno, primeramente yo soy nuevo en este espacio y no les conozco a ustedes, por lo tanto no podría como decir, ¿no? Entonces me gustaría conocerles más para poder decir. Segundo, nosotros aquí, por ejemplo, en el tema de la difusión, elaboración de productos para difundir en las radios o a través de las redes sociales. Eso es uno. Dos, poder apoyar en asesoramiento jurídico o pago a abogados para poder sacar preso o librarles de la judicialización. Tres, en el tema de acciones de movilización que la gente hace. Para nosotros es bien un poco complicado salir a las ciudades para movilizarnos o acompañar a los dirigentes. Eso sería como una primera parte.
I just want to say that I don't know all of you really well, so I don't know exactly what you would be able to do, but I'd really love to get to know you well. And things that we would need help with would be things like how to make a good radio program, how to operate on social networks, and we need help with legal aid because we need to get our prisoners out of jail and we need to stop all the legalized things that are being used against us. It's also very hard if you can run any demonstrations to support us. That's very hard for us to do. We find that very hard to do here, but that's another big area. Thanks.
Y en la segunda parte, algo que por donde somos débiles nuestras comunidades es porque el gobierno les ofrece recursos económicos, ingresos. Entonces nosotros frente a eso es un poco difícil tener un discurso. Entonces lo que hacemos es apoyar con pequeñas iniciativas económicas en los territorios para que la gente pueda tener una actividad económica y decir, sabe que ya no necesito la minería porque yo estoy solucionando mi problema económico.
If we are weak, it's because we can't get money, and so if we could support economically people living in those areas, First Nations people, then they don't need to work in mining and they don't need to work in extractivism.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Hugo.
Bien, gracias hermana Marisol. Bien, si hubiera esa buena voluntad de querer apoyar a esta causa para que no exista el extractivismo y otras cosas negativas para nuestros pueblos, lo que yo tengo entendido sería apoyar en la realización de talleres, encuentros, foros, para poder socializar la problemática de nuestros pueblos y a la vez también para poder decir de que para que se autorreconozca uno por su autoidentificación de quién soy, de dónde vengo y a dónde quiero ir. Estoy seguro de que encontrando nuestra identidad vamos a encontrar también nuestra dignidad, donde que tenemos que defender lo que es nuestro, la tierra y territorio. Entonces, el trabajo es socializar en encuentros, talleres, y para ello sería pues gestar la unidad de los pueblos, ¿no? Eso sería de manera concreta mi participación en este aspecto de que si hubiera apoyo, ¿no? Sería eso, sería muy positivo su ayuda. Muchas gracias.
In the area of getting rid of extractivism and all kinds of shops, forums, we need to train and educate people on the issues. And our own identity is a critical issue. Who am I and where would I like to go? We need to find our dignity and our own identity as a people and our links and our connections to the land. So I believe that educating people and supporting unity is something that would be so important if it were possible to have help in that way. Thank you.
Bueno, y nos queda muy poco tiempo. Me gustaría pedirle a ustedes, lo último, a los oradores, si quisieran decir algunas palabras como de despedida y, por supuesto, agradecerles su participación. So what I'm saying is that we are very close to the end of this important conversation. And I asked the speakers if they would like to make the last comment before we move to the announcement. And from there, we will continue promoting all the rest of the activities that we have part of this IMAR conference. ¿Sí? ¿Le gustaría el último mensaje, hermanos? ¿Y quién empieza primero? Severino, ¿ya?
Hay que internacionalizar la lucha. Gracias.
This struggle has to become international. We have to internationalize the struggle. Thanks very much.
Hugo.
Bien, hermana, gracias Marisol, muchas gracias. Lo que sí realmente quería agregar a mi comentario en último, es de que no solamente ese apoyo que se nos pueda brindar solamente sería para salir del extractivismo, sino sería para poder a nosotros realmente en todos los aspectos. Entonces es por ello donde que yo manifesté de que es necesario que nos autoidentifiquemos. Entonces, en ese aspecto, los hermanos de Bolivia nos han ganado, por eso ya tienen un gobierno indígena, aunque de repente nuestro hermano Lucho no lo sea, sin embargo, el hermano vicepresidente David Chactoanca sí lo son, y el gobierno de Bolivia es en base a la identidad cultural de su pueblo merinario, anterior participación. Entonces, lo que dice el hermano Severino, estoy de acuerdo con la internacionalización de nuestra lucha. Pues aquí aprovecharía este espacio para poder invitar, aunque nuestra organización no ha estado en esta reunión en Bolivia, hace poco, en la asunción de mando del hermano Evo, Lucho y David, el hermano Evo Morales se reunió con varias organizaciones y ahí convocan a un encuentro internacional de pueblos indígenas a nivel de América, que será el 17, el 18, el 19 de diciembre. Entonces yo creo que allí sería necesario que nos encontremos y podamos hacer la unión de nuestros pueblos por el bienestar de nuestros pueblos de América y todo el mundo. Muchísimas gracias, hermana Marisol, hermano Lucho, a los organizadores, a todos los presentes. Un abrazo fuerte desde el más profundo de mi corazón. Muchísimas gracias.
I agree with my brother Severino that this has to be an international struggle, and it's not just getting rid of extractivism itself and mining. We need to find our identity. We need to find a First Nations way, and Bolivia has now got an indigenous government, and as I say, I agree with the question of internationalization. But there's a big event coming up from the 17th, 18th and 19th of December, which is the inauguration of the First Nations president of Bolivia. And I think we should all go there and get together to bring about more unity and I think there should be unity and in the Americas, but also in the whole world. And I want to send you out a big hug from the deepest part of my heart to everybody.
Thank you, Hugo. Sebastián.
Sí. Bueno, creo que estoy de acuerdo con todas las partes. La unificación de las luchas sociales de los pueblos indígenas de América es vital para mantenerse en el tiempo. Pero para llegar a esa unificación y mantener la lucha se necesita escuelas de pensamiento para las nuevas generaciones, para que no desistan, para que este pensamiento o esta lucha, este proceso no muera en el tiempo, sino que prosiga, porque extractivismo y megaproyectos, eso no va a pasar en poco tiempo, vienen futuros. Entonces, la nueva generación se tiene que preparar. Afortunadamente ya hay procesos a nivel internacional que va en pro de la unificación de la lucha. Está el proceso que empodera desde Venezuela de la creación de la Organización Mundial de los Pueblos Indígenas, en la cual tuvimos la oportunidad de ser partícipes de su lanzamiento como idea original, pues. Y ahí está, y yo sé que se va a construir, entonces no hay que desistir la lucha, y la fórmula es esa, la unificación. Y muchas gracias a todos, a Lucho, a Marisol, ha sido un placer, aquí estamos, aquí continuamos.
I think that I totally agree with the fact that the struggle there has to be unity in this struggle of First Nations people. And we have to really seriously keep thinking of the new generations, of the young people coming up, so that the struggle doesn't just fizzle out. Because, yes, we've got to fight extractivism, and these mega projects are not going anywhere. They're continuing on. There are processes in the world, around different parts of the world, to bring about unity in our struggle. And the World Organization of Indigenous Peoples this is a really this is a really original idea to have this world organization of our peoples. And I think that that is a way for us to really work together all over the world. And I really want to thank Lucho and Marisol for the incredible work they've done. And we're not going anywhere. We are here and we're still fighting. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. It has been amazing to listen the stories, and sad that extractivism, you know, is causing so much damage around the world, and the death of so many people. And now in Colombia, more than 700 families without having any assistance. That's so terrible. I'm going to pass it to Marian Mas for the announcement. And from there, we are going to finish our conversation, discussion, and sharing a part of this solidarity conference, you know, beyond mining, how we can protect our land, our water, and the life of those ones we live. Yeah, Marian.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Marisol. And thank you so much. Muchas gracias a Severino, a Sebastián, y a Hugo. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Thank you, everyone who's been here on this part of this discussion today, and to everyone who will listen to the recording in the future. We really appreciate your presence and your contribution and your participation in this workshop and in all of the workshops this week. We'd like to really uplift this current fundraising campaign that is connected with Sebastián's community, the Wayuu people in Colombia, who have recently been hit by the Hurricane Lota in the past weeks. As Sebastián brought up, they're in a serious humanitarian situation and urgently needing to raise funds to care for people who are being displaced and lost their homes due to this hurricane as a result, as Sebastián said, of climate change and the impacts of extractivism in Colombia and Latin America. So if people have the capacity to donate towards this fundraising campaign, the LASNet bank details are here on the slide. We also have a post in the LASNet Solidarity Facebook page, which you can like and you can see there. If you could please share it, even if you are not able to donate yourself, to share that through your networks. And also there is an open meeting that is going to be held in the coming weeks, and which is open for all who are listening to this podcast, who are participating here now, to attend, to discuss, learn more about the struggles and movements of Latin America and how we can increase and improve our solidarity and support from so-called Australia and the Asia Pacific, and build bridges of solidarity and international struggle and movement. So if you are interested to come along to that meeting, please send us your interest to lasnet.solidarity@gmail.com, the email that's on the screen, and we'll send information to you how to participate in the Zoom and in-person meetings that are coming up soon. You can also—
Is that on the 6th of December, yeah, Marian?
Sorry?
Is that the one on the 6th of December?
Yeah, there's on the 6th of the most recent one coming up on the 6th of December. Thank you.
Yep.
And yeah, and some other announcements for tonight at 8 p.m. A call for change, no mining in Latin America, so-called Australia and beyond. A discussion and a short documentary from 8 p.m. till 10 p.m. So the link is here in the slide, but you can also see the link. The Facebook event is on the Beyond Mining, Protecting Land, Water and Life Facebook event, which you can find on the Blockade IMARC Facebook. And the Zoom link for that event and that documentary is in the Facebook event. And there will be speakers, Uncle Kevin Bozzacott, an Arabana elder and activist, part of the anti-uranium struggles in central so-called Australia on Arabana land. Pora Bibi, a West Papuan activist and artist and musician, and Rongai, a settler artist and activist, will be speakers part of that event. So really encourage people to get along to that event and to the upcoming events for the rest of the counter conference, which goes until the 29th. And yeah, to participate, to share the events, and also these are being recorded and going to be available afterwards for people. And the full program you can find at this website, blockadeimark.com/actions-events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marian. I would like to thank Marie de Laura. Marie de Laura has been, as you hear, translating from Spanish into English to everyone. And we don't know what will be, you know, what can possibly we could invite speakers from Latin America without having Marie de Laura support, and also the availability, I think is amazing. Thank you so much, Mary. I don't think that I have ways to you know, to say how grateful we are, because sometimes we don't have information and it's a very short notice and you still make the time and you work full time. So it's amazing. Thank you so much. And
it's a privilege to work with such courageous people.
No, thank you, Marie. And also to thank again Sebastián Epieu, a leader from Indigenous Wayuu from Colombia, and Hugo Takuri, also an Indigenous leader from Indigenous communities in Peru, and Sebastián Charupi, another Indigenous leader, this time from Ecuador. Muchas gracias, hermanos. As Mapuche people will say, Shaltumay Lamien. So that means the same. Gracias, hermanos, por estar aquí, y a lot of newen. So mucha fuerza and a lot of strength. Y bueno, hemos terminado. Si alguien quiere decir unas palabras finales, pero estamos terminando este episodio de esta conferencia, que es denunciar lo que las minerías, ¿cierto? Las mineras y las compañías extractivistas están haciendo en nuestro territorio. So this is an important event. This is a conference where we are denouncing what extractivism, you know, multinational corporations in general are doing and how they are destroying our planet. Gracias.
Marichuel.
Marichuel.